Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I am extremely excited. It has been months in the making, but I am rejoined by guest Jack Markwardt. Hey, Jack, how are you?
Good morning, Dale. How are you?
I'm very good. Well, welcome back to the show. I know it's you've been on the show many times and that sort of thing. And I think the last time you were on the show, we were doing this series on the history of the Shroud, looking at the documentary evidence for the Shroud throughout the centuries. And today we're going to be continuing on with that, covering the period from 1001 up to 1207 AD. But just before we get into that, I just want to turn it over to you. What have you been up to since you've been last on the show?
Well, I think we've had this gap for as long as it has been because I was involved with making a couple of presentations to the international conference that was held in St. Louis at the end of July. So naturally, I had to select my topics and I had to research and work on them, which took a number of months for two presentations. Um, and then I appeared at the conference. I made those presentations, and that was just less than a month ago when that transpired. And since then, since we had this scheduled, I had to get ready for this. So that between the two of those things, it's kept me pretty busy.
Awesome, awesome. So yeah. With that said, I'm really looking forward to this topic because I think that you do probably the most thorough job in terms of outlining the historical evidence there. So yeah. With that said, I will bring up your slides and we can get straight into it.
Okay, and if you would kindly move my slides along when I indicate that, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, optimize for video sharing. And hopefully is that showing up?
All right.
And just let me know, is it showing it, is it full screen, the slide?
Yeah,
Perfect.
it is. Let me just do one thing with my computer here to make it full screen for me. There we go. Okay. I thought that I would start because it's been too long by doing a couple things just for the benefit of people who may not have seen the earlier shows, who may watch this show and may want to go back, kind of explain what happened here. Um, this was originally envisioned as being a three-way discussion show. I was going to be the proponent for my own historical hypothesis, which involves ultimately a cloth that was called the Image of God Incarnate and which became known as the Sindon. Uh, there was going to be another participant who was going to take the part and be the proponent of the hypothesis that the shroud was once the image of Edessa, which became the Mandylion. And then there was a third skeptical participant who was going to take the position that no, there was never a shroud at all until medieval times. And we've done three shows, and the proponent for the Mandylion theory never participated. And the skeptic participated in two shows and not in the last, and is not participating today. So it kind of put us in a position of so that people could understand. I've been simultaneously presenting the history that pertains to both my own hypothesis and the image of Edessa Mandylion hypothesis, which is formulated in 1978 by Ian Wilson. And I've been trying to be as knowledgeable and informative and fair about that presentation, although I do not agree with the hypothesis. And we've gotten through part one, and I put the link for that. We went 500 years. Then we moved to part two. We went about 400 years. That's the link to that. The next slide, please. Then part three, that's the one we most recently did. We did 100 years because that was in the 10th century, and a whole lot of things were happening, especially with the Mandillion during that period. And now we're in part four, and this is going to take us from the year 1001 into the new millennium up to the year 1207. And a lot of people, when they do think about the history of the Shroud, they think the cutoff is usually 1204, where there was the sack of Constantinople, and the Shroud, we contend, was exhibited at that time. But I'm going to go a little bit beyond that for reasons that will become apparent when I do that. Okay, we can move on.
All right.
So here we are, we're at the year 1100, and what we've come through is there are two cloth relics now in Constantinople. They're both in the imperial relic collection. The first is the Mandillion, and that is, without a doubt, the way that it was described at that time, all theories aside. It's a small tau, and it has an Akira Puatis, that means a not made by human hands image of Jesus' face. All the references are strictly to a facial image of Jesus. And we have the Sindon, which is, by its name, it is Jesus' burial cloth. They are two distinct relics that are in the collection, as we will see as we go along here. Now, I just want to say something about the Mandillion up to this point, because it's been a long trek up to here. I've always found it curious that people who embrace the Mandillion theory are able to do so with approximately, they could probably explain the Mandillion theory up to the year 1100 in about a minute to two. There's really not very much substantive to it. It's based entirely, almost entirely, on a legend called the Abgar legend. And the story very quickly is that the apostles fold the shroud, they then frame it, they nail it to a board, and they take it to King Abgar in Edessa, who had been in communication with Jesus per the legend. Abgar dies, and eventually his grandson comes to the throne, and he's a pagan. He starts persecuting Christians, and so the Christians in Edessa place the image, the portrait, the cloth that becomes the Mandillion by the year 1100. They place that in the walls of the city. Now, I don't have to know anything about the history of that cloth for the next 500 years. I simply say that it was in the wall and it was forgotten, and nobody knew that it was there. The next time I have to say anything about this history is in the 6th century, and what I say, per Wilson's hypothesis, is that the Mandillion cloth was discovered in the walls of Edessa sometime after 2525, when there was a flood. The problem is there's no historical records that substantiate such a discovery. And the second problem is the very legend, the Abgar legend, that placed it in the wall in the first place, says that that's not how it was rediscovered. It was rediscovered in 544, when the Persian army was besieging Edessa, and a bishop, who we don't know historically of, had a vision of a woman, and the woman said, I'm going to take you to the hiding place of the cloth, and she takes him to the hiding place, or tells him where it is. In any event, now we've finished the first 500 years of the history of the Mandillion. We have only really one thing to say about the 6th century, and that is that in 593, a bishop named Evagrius is writing a church history and mentions that when the Persians were besieging Edessa in 544, a image of Jesus, which was Quiriquatus, was brought out by the citizens. And that's all he really has to say about it, except that when it was brought out, it helped save the city from the Persian siege. The Persians turned around and went home through the power of the image. And now we don't have to really talk about the Mandylion very much anymore, because in the following century, Edessa is conquered by Muslims. And, it's like Las Vegas. Whatever happens in Edessa stays in Edessa. There's not really much that is said about the cloth for the next 400 years. And until it is brought to Constantinople in 944. So that may have taken me 3 minutes, 5 minutes with a little elaboration, but I've now told you what the complete history, based on a legend, is of the Mandylion. And this is what a lot of people embrace because it's an easy to understand story. It's entertaining. It doesn't have very much historical substance to it, but it gets the shroud from Jerusalem to Constantinople. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, so just before we move on, I just wanted to ask you
Yes.
a couple questions just for the audience sake. So number one, so the second cloth, the Sindon, as Jesus's burial cloth, this is what people were calling the cloth that you called the image of God incarnate,
Yes,
correct?
and I'm going to cover that after I finish with the Mandylion.
Okay. And the other one, so I noticed you jumped, we're covering from 1001 to 1207. I noticed you jumped to 1100. So are you saying that from between 1001 to
I'm
1100?
sorry, that's a typo. That should read 1,000, right?
Okay. All right, cool. I'll fix that in the before posting it.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So what I want to do quickly is what happened in the 10th century, what we did on the last show vis-a-vis the Mandylion. So next slide, please. So in 944, the image of Edessa is brought from Edessa to Constantinople. What we do know about this, other than that it's a facial image of Jesus on a cloth, is it bears some sign of blood. Now, before it gets to Constantinople, we don't know anything about it. We don't know that it has some sign of blood. Next slide. And how do we now know it? Because 944, on the day that it gets into Constantinople, there is a priest by the name of Gregory Referendarius, and he writes a sermon, and we have this quote from the sermon. This reflection, meaning this image, has been imprinted only by the sweat from the face of the ruler of life, that's Jesus, falling like drops of blood. So it's formed in his view by sweat, but the sweats fall like drops of blood. He doesn't say that it's blood, but he says it's sweat that falls like a drop of blood would be. Next slide. And then there's this other history. This is called the Narratio. This is written and published the next year by the Emperor Constantine VII. And it wants to explain how the image got on the cloth. And up till this time, the prevailing story was from the Acts of Thaddeus, which go back to the 7th century, in which Jesus washes his face, dries his face, and then the image of his face forms on the cloth. In the Narratio, they say, yeah, there's that story, but there's another story going around too. And this is what the quote is from the Narratio. When Christ prayed in anguish, his sweat fell like drops of blood, and then it is said that he took this piece of cloth and wiped off the streams of sweat on it. The figure of his divine face, which is still visible, was immediately transferred onto it. So again, consistent with Gregory Referendius's sermon, the image that they're looking at looks like it's been formed by sweat, but the sweat fell like drops of blood. And so there seems to be an indication with all these references to sweat flowing like drops of blood, that there's some sign of blood on that cloth that is at that time, still the image of Edessa. It's not known as the Mandylion. It will become known as the Mandylion fairly soon after that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the nausea also looks back to the previous year, and it says that after very few people in the imperial palace take a look at it, it's placed on the right side of the Pharaoh's chapel toward the east for the glory of the faithful, for the safety of the emperors, and the security of the whole city, together with the Christian community. And so that is where the image of Edessa Mandylion is placed. Now, it's not likely that it was hanging there as a cloth, because, next slide.
Okay, and just to clarify with this slide, so the audience knows, you're quoting the Narratio, which the document dates to 945, but it's reporting events 1 year earlier in 945.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, it's reporting what happened the day. All this essentially happened in one day, maybe a night and a day, but the image of Edessa got to Edessa, I think, on an evening, and the next day it is sort of paraded around the city. Actually, if you read the text, it probably was not paraded exposed where the people could see it. It was paraded around in its case, in a closed case. And then at the end of the day, when all the ceremonials were over, then it was placed, and really in the next slide, I'll show that it was placed in its case on the right side of the Pharaoh's chapel. Now, just so people understand, the Pharaoh's chapel is a part of the palace, of the imperial palace. It's the emperor's private chapel. So this palace is called the Bucolian Palace in Constantinople, and that's where the image of Edessa was taken, where it was stored, and that's where we're going to find it when we start this at the year 1000.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thanks so much.
Okay, next slide. Oops. And one other thing I'd like to mention is that if you go a couple centuries beyond this, when the Fourth Crusade is encamped in front of the city of Constantinople, Robert de Clary, who wrote a memoir of the sack of Constantinople, he records that at this time, while he's there, the Mandylion, which it's called at that time, he doesn't call it that, but this cloth is in a vessel of gold, which is hung by two heavy silver chains in the Pharaoh's chapel. So it's likely that he's describing what was the situation for the past several hundred years at that time. So we move on to what was this image of Edessa. We talked about this briefly last time. As Ian Wilson hypothesizes, it's the shroud. It's been folded. It's been framed. It's been nailed to a board, and it's been trellised. You know, the figure here is being shown is like a cameo of the facial image, and then the design that is around it is the trellis work. And because it's this solid piece with a frame, you've got rigid dimensions of 43 inches long and 24 inches wide. So from left to right, it's 43 inches. From top to bottom, it's 24 inches. You know, it's a fairly large cloth. I mean, in its length, it's almost 4 feet long. And so if this was true, then this case that it would have been put into, that's hanging from the ceiling of the Pharaoh's chapel, would have to be at least 4 foot long to hold it, because it's rigid, it can't be folded. And that just seems, it's possible, but it just seems rather unlikely. Next slide. Whereas what the history tells us when we go to historical documents and historical evidence is we do have a portrayal of the Mandylion that was made between 945 and 959. We know that because King Abgar here has the face of Emperor Constantine VII, and that's when he ruled. And this painting is found in the monastery of Saint Catherine, which we know that Constantine sponsored, at that particular time. But if you take a look at this, this is what you would more expect, I think, the image of Edessa to be based on its previous descriptions. It's a cloth. It's about the size of a towel. There's no evidence of folding. As a matter of fact, it has fringe along the bottom where the folds would be. And if you look at it, it is not folded, it's not framed, it's not nailed to a board, and it's not trellised. So that this is artistic. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate. But if you look at this, this is anything but what Ian Wilson has theorized the image of Edessa was at this very time. Next slide, please. Okay. And I pointed out that it's my belief that the image of Edessa was actually a former Byzantine labarum. A labarum is the standards that the Byzantine army carried. And in the 6th century, we know through Byzantine historians that they carried a labarum that bore the face of Jesus, and that face was taken from the image of God incarnate, which was a Quiriquatus relic then kept in the 6th and 7th century. It was kept in the imperial relic collection. To the right here is an example of a standard that was made in the 4th century. It shows Constantine and his 2 sons, but it kind of shows what a standard looks like, and you can see the similarities between it and the portrayal of the image of Edessa Mandylion icon.
Next slide.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay. And I want to mention this because it's always mentioned. I don't think it has any historical value. A couple hundred years after the time we're talking, a couple hundred years after the Mandylion comes to Constantinople, a fellow by the name of John Scalitzes writes a history of the Byzantine, of part of the history of the Byzantine Empire. And there are monks in Sicily who draw portrayals and illustrations of this. So this is something that was done, this illustration was done something a couple of years after the events by an artist, probably a monk, who is simply reading the text. And this is supposed to be the presentation to the king at that time, to the emperor at that time, of the image of Edessa when it's brought to Constantinople. Now, what you hear people saying, I mean, this is just totally fictional portrayal anyway, and you will hear people, especially authenticists, who are purporting to write history, you'll hear them say that this is an accurate portrayal. And if you look at this, there's a cloth that extends between the presenter on the left and the emperor Romulus on the right. And so this is really the face of the shroud. And then you can see the rest of the shroud is extending between the presenter and the emperor. But number one, it's a different color. The image itself is what we would expect on a linen cloth. It's white. It's got fringe, just like you've seen on the earlier portrayal, right? That's at the top. We saw it at the bottom. The bottom is sort of hidden by the emperor here. And then take a look at what a number of these gentlemen are wearing. It was a garment called the loris, which went from their back over their shoulder and then to the front. It just draped over. And both of these royals, or I guess it's supposed to be a royal on the left there too, it might be the general, are wearing a loris. And so it's very clear that they don't want to touch, they don't want their hands to touch the holy object that they're extending and receiving. And so if you go to the gentleman on the left, that's his loris. You can see it going to his back. It's extending over his front, and he's using that. And he's putting his hand under it in order to put the image on top of us. And the same way, the gentleman, the emperor on the right here, is either using that same loris or his own loris so that his hands don't touch the cloth. So this is not, it's used again for people who are in the business of trying to convince people by visual objects, which are, much easier to understand anyway, that this is an actual like snapshot of what happened in 944, and that, gee, what are we talking about here? The mandillion must be the shroud, because here it is. It's a long cloth. It's not just a facial image. But it's really kind of a silly argument, but it's made so often that I wanted to make sure that people can look at this and have a different and probably the correct understanding of what it portrays. So it's around the year 990 now, about 50 years later, that we first get records that the image of Edessa is called the mandillion. So somewhere along the line, I mean, the people in Constantinople didn't want to keep calling their new relic the image of Edessa. They could have named it the image of Constantinople now, but they decided to name it the mandillion, which really derives from an Arab word that also makes a reference to a small cloth, not to a large cloth. Now, turn our attention now to the Sindon. And again, this is kind of a complicated history. It's taken me a number of shows to go through all the things of what the history of the image of God incarnate is, which becomes the Sindon. But essentially, it's the shroud, and the shroud is taken to Antioch, and it's preserved there during the persecutions of the Christians. It ultimately
just sorry to interrupt. Am I supposed to go to the next slide or?
No, not yet.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay. The persecutions of the Christians extend beyond Constantine because he was succeeded in about the year 360 or so by Julian the Apostate, and he started persecution of the Christians primarily in, but not exclusively in, Antioch. And there are records that say that the treasures of the Antioch Cathedral, which would have by that time included the shroud, were then hidden away because Julian the Apostate would have seized and destroyed them. And it is my hypothesis that a couple of hundred years later, in around the year 535 or thereabouts, that Antioch, which was then beset by a couple of earthquakes and fires, they had to reconstruct the walls at that time, that there suddenly appeared in the city of Antioch what's described as an awesome image of Christ. And that 2 years later, Antioch is under siege by the Persians. And for the first time in known history, the patriarch of that city, instead of staying with it in the attack, he leaves the city, and he's documented as having gone to Anatolia. And Anatolia is what we know as Turkey, and you go through Anatolia and you are at Constantinople. And this patriarch was an appointee had been a civil servant of the emperor at that time, Justinian the First. And so that's how the image of God, that's how the image um, got to Constantinople. And there's plenty of evidence for it being in Constantinople, pantocrator images, uh, something called crux majoris, measuring the body of Jesus, a number of indications, including a text that for the first time says that this image that's in Anatolia is paraded around Anatolia, and it is called Akira Pilatus, or not made by human hands. And it's the first time that that term is ever used to describe an image of Jesus. Some 25 years before that description is used to describe the image of Edessa. We go all the way to 741, and we have, through a document that we'll get to today, the Tarragona manuscript. We talked about it a bit last time. A story of how the image of Jesus in Constantinople was locked away in a golden case, and it was allowed thereafter to be viewable only by the emperor himself. And the emperor at that time was an iconoclast, Constantine V. And therefore, there was a bargain made between God and Constantine V that this image would no longer be seen by anyone other than the emperor, and in return, God would keep these earthquakes, which had been hitting Constantinople for a year, that they would cease. And coincidentally or not, the bargain was kept, the earthquake stopped, and that is where the image of God Incarnate, otherwise known as the Shroud, was kept in the imperial palace for the next couple of hundred years. And the next time we hear about it is really in 958. So this is after the image of Edessa has gotten to Constantinople. That same emperor, Constantine VII, writes to his army and says, I'm going to send you some holy water that will protect you. And it's been blessed with various relics. And he says one of the relics that it was blessed with was the Sindon. And so he confirms at that point that there is a relic that was the burial cloth of Jesus. That's the meaning of Sindon in the scriptures as a relic. And that is physically present then in Constantinople. Now, this is no surprise because, we don't have the time today to go through all the reasons that the image of God Incarnate was a full body image of Jesus, but there are things such as the crux measuralis, which measured Jesus' body. There was a garment from the 6th century, 5th century called the tablion, which represented the shroud. It was a predecessor of the loris. And we do have the pantocrator images that were made at that time. We have the something called the Akira Pita. It's a full body image of Jesus, then made by Pope Gregory, who was the ambassador for the Vatican at that time to Constantinople. And we even have a canon from 692 that says from this point on, Jesus should not be portrayed as a lamb or some other symbol. He should be portrayed as a human being, and you should portray his humiliation and suffering. And so how is his humiliation and suffering to be portrayed if it's not to be portrayed through his body, which was flogged and beaten and crucified? And in the same year, in 692, there is this famous gold Silitus coin, which shows Jesus in a pantocrator image form. And the emperor at that time, on that same coin, is wearing the loris, which is a representation of the shroud. So they're not doing all these things in Byzantium on the basis of some tau-sized object that is allegedly in Edessa. These are all indicia that the shroud or some long cloth with an image of Jesus is in Constantinople. And the final sign, I think, before we start off with the new segment, is that why did Constantine the Seventh? People don't really ask about this too much, but why did he call this relic a syndon? A syndon is technically in Greek, it just means a linen cloth. But when it's in the context of being among the relics, it has to be a relic of Jesus' passion, like this crown of thorns and the nails and what have you. Why does he know that it's Jesus' burial cloth? And I think the answer to that is that there was an image of the crucified Jesus on it. And that's why he knew that it was the burial cloth. And finally, we get to the Latin sermon, which I mentioned last time. And this is in 988 at the wedding of the Tsar of the Rus in Russian territory and the sister of the Emperor of Byzantium, in which there's a sermon preached, which deals with the Abgar legend, but now for the first time, the Abgar legend is changed around. It is no longer referring to just an image of Jesus' face. It says that Jesus stretched his entire body on a linen cloth, and that's what he sent to Abgar. So why is that legend changing at this time within 30 years of Constantine the Seventh mentioning that there's a syndon in Constantinople? And the obvious explanation is that the Princess Anna was aware of the presence of the cloth, of the syndon, that there wasn't full body image of Jesus on that cloth, and that she instructed that the sermon to be preached at her wedding should make reference to it. Okay, so I think we can get to the next slide finally. And
I just have a couple of questions if you don't
sure, yeah.
Yeah, so okay, so you mentioned in your presentation, and I know we covered this in earlier presentations and stuff, but just once again, very quickly for the audience in this show, you mentioned that the image of God incarnate, or this syndon from the 1000s AD, it was the first to be called "not made with human hands." That Greek word. Can you just kind of briefly say, I think you mentioned in another show there are a total of three cloths known to history that have had this title. Can you name what those three were and when
Right,
in
right.
chronological
Yep,
order?
that's easy for me. So the first one is the image of God incarnate. It's referenced in the Chronicle of Suda Zachariah, which was published in the year 568.
Mhm.
And so that says that the cloth that was marched around and exhibited for 6 years in Anatolia was a Kiripoatis, or not made by human hands. About 2 years after that, in the year 570, there is a pilgrim who's visiting Egypt, and he claims he saw an Akira Poatis image of Jesus in, I think, the city of Memphis, if I recall correctly, in Egypt. Nothing further is known of that cloth. And then in the year 593, Evagrius, who was a church historian, he's telling, as part of the history of the church, he's talking about the siege of Edessa by the Persian army in 544. And so he's talking about an event that happened about 50 years prior to that time. And by the way, that siege is described by lay historians like Procopius, and there's no mention whatsoever of an image of Jesus. But but Evagrius claims in his history that, as I mentioned, that during the siege, the image of Jesus, not made by human hands, was brought forth. He has this fanciful story that it was used to assist in lighting a fire that set fire to the Persian siege works, and but that's all he says about it. He does not say that the image is made of cloth. And in all honesty, because there was the Abgar legend at that time in 593 was the Abgar legend that went back to the doctrine of Adai. That image of Jesus was not on cloth. It's the one in which Abgar's servant goes and paints Jesus with choice colors. So the knowledge of an image of Jesus at that time um, is not necessarily based on a cloth, and we do not know what the image of Edessa looked like in the 6th century. And in fact, if you go back to the Syriac texts that were being written at that time, and Syriac is the native language of Edessa, so they were the texts being written in Edessa and around Edessa, they all described the image of Edessa at that time as being a painting on wood. So it would seem that Evagrius is saying, well, they've got something over there that looks like a painting on wood, but it's really not made by human hands. Also, Evagrius, when he wrote his history, he used various sources. And it's known that one of the sources that he used was the Chronicle of Pseudo Zachariah. So he was totally familiar with the whole story that had been told about the image of God incarnate. He knew that there was an image not made by human hands that was on cloth, on a linen cloth. And it appears then that he just kind of appropriated that term when he wrote his history in 593. So those are the three Tiraquatis cloths of the 6th century. And the first one, the precedent setting one, was the image of God incarnate.
Okay. So is there because the image of Memphis, Egypt, that's different than the image of Beirut. So is the image of Beirut also one of these things, but it comes after the 6th century, is what you're saying? Or
No, there is, well, we'll put it this way. In the 6th century, when this is written, there is not even a documented image of Beirut. The image of Beirut is something that spun out of, that was created after the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. There was a sermon given at that time called the Sermon of Athanasius. So it was attributed to the 4th century, but it was no one knew of it before the 7th century. And in that sermon, it's very weird, but there is a Jew, a Jewish person living in Beirut, and has in his room an image of Jesus, a full length image of Jesus, but it says it's painted on slats of board. And for some reason, he's evicted from his room, and the room is taken over by Jewish people who own the property. And then they take this image, they find it there, and they actually, it's a very anti Semitic text. It actually says that the Jewish people committed various desecrations against this image. And this image, other than that text, it really doesn't show up again until much later. But even the people who promote that theory say that it did not get to Constantinople, they claim, until about the year 977. And remember that the Sindon is already in Constantinople in 958 when Constantine VII refers to it in his harangue to his troops. So the Sindon cannot be the Beirut icon, and the Beirut icon is never really claimed to be a Tiraquatis.
okay, awesome. So in all of history up to 1207, it's only those three things, cloths dating back to the 6th century that have.
Right, and the cloth in Memphis is almost kind of what I would call a throwout. Somebody reported it, one pilgrim reported it. There's not very much details about it, and nobody ever hears about it again.
Gotcha. Okay. So this is the last question, then we can move on.
Sure.
And it it might not be a bit fair because I know science isn't your thing, but it did come up when I was preparing for my debate, when I was researching the waxes. And the reason I bring it up here is because Giulio Fonte, when he was doing the wax dating in his most recent paper, they did evaluate the four different historical hypotheses that, as he saw it, right? So he did the image of Edessa, he did the image of Memphis, he also did the image of Beirut, and he did your theory, but he kind of messed it up. He it was the image of Kameliana, so he thought it went through
Right.
Kameliana and then onwards. But
Mhm.
obviously, he's kind of found that based on his results, the best thing is the image of Beirut hypothesis is most consistent with that. So I was just kind of curious, like what are your thoughts on his findings that the image of Beirut best fit the wax profile? And secondly, do you think that that could be possible because your theory actually he got it wrong? It's actually went to Antioch, which is kind of close, to Beirut, I guess. And then went from there to Constantinople. Like, yeah, do you have any thoughts on the wax
Well,
theory?
number one, I haven't read what Fonte wrote, and number two, I'm not sure how Fonte has familiarity with my uh, hypothesis. He's never referred to it before in any way. The fact that he mentions Kameliana, that's what the legend says. The legend says that this cloth came
Yeah.
out of a well from Kameliana, but the history is that it was called the image of God incarnate by the Byzantines. So he doesn't seem to know that much.
Yeah,
Uh, I'm a
he
little,
follows the legend. So yeah, he gets it wrong.
yeah. Um, Also, he's been a proponent of the Ian Wilson Mandelian hypothesis for a long time. He did a paper before on that 692 coin, and he's got a an artist or somebody who works at the mint traveling to Edessa in order to pick up all the fine details of the image that show on that coin, and he totally ignores the fact that at that very moment, the image of Kameliana, which is the palladium, or the image of God incarnate, which is the palladium of the city of Constantinople. It's like it doesn't exist, and nobody would even look at it there. So I can't really say on the scientific side. I'm not sure what he's measuring, but I've seen critical reviews of the science that's involved with that. I don't know if it's come from Hugh Farry or from other sources, but I read everything.
Mhm.
And I know that the criticisms of the wax approach is that I think it's highly tied into things like humidity, uh,
Yeah.
especially humidity and other considerations, that this is almost pure guesswork work about what the humidity was in these various places at that time. So I think what he's doing is he's looking at temperature charts for different areas, and he's just saying that he gets his best or oldest date or what have you if he looks at the temperatures in Beirut as opposed to the temperatures in Edessa or in Antioch. And they're all pretty much in the same area. And I think one of the criticisms is that it's not fine enough, the calculations on what the humidity was in one place or the other. So yeah, I kind of believe what Paolo Di Lazzaro says a lot. Shoemaker, make your shoes.
Mhm.
And if you're going to be doing a scientific uh, paper like this, then stick to the science, say what the humidity is, and if for some reason you want to point out what it is in various cities. But he's trying to combine this with his understanding of the historical roots of these various images, which I don't think he has a full grasp of.
Now, if you don't mind me kind of just giving my take on that, because
Surely.
believe it or not, I see this as confirmation of your hypothesis.
Well, of course
Because
you're right.
yeah, because look, even though yes, it advocates for the image of Beirut kind of thing, it's most consistent with that hypothesis. The only reason for that is because he has this false understanding of, oh, well, yours is the image of Kameliana. So it's there in Kameliana for centuries in this well, and then it's discovered. And Julio has done kind of refined the calculations in the latest the third paper that he published, where look, a matter of decades isn't going to make a difference. It's more on the matter of centuries. So yet the reason why it's inconsistent with the Kameliana thing is because obviously you don't posit it was even in Kameliana, let alone there for centuries. Kind of
Wasn't in a well. This is just a legend. He's a legend believer. It's why he believes in the Mendelian theory. These are just legends. They're made up. They're
yeah.
not historical. They're not factual.
Yeah, so these paths do are easily distinguished, right? We know it didn't go to Edessa, kind of thing. It didn't go to Kameliana for these proposed legendary things, but
Right.
the image of Beirut thing is also consistent, the wax profile. If your theory, as you actually
Right.
stated, were true, it went to Antioch for
Yes.
centuries,
Yes.
and then
How
it went
far is
straight.
Antioch from Beirut? It's not far. And
It's
they
not.
both, when they both leave there, in different centuries, I think that the Beirut uh, theory is that it's the 10th century. Like I said, around 977 or so, it's brought to Constantinople. I say that it went from Antioch to Constantinople in 540. So, I mean, they are essentially the same geographical paths. So, yeah. But again, I don't think that Giulio Fonte or a lot of these Mandylian believers have an understanding of what I've written. I don't think they want to read a 300-page book, especially if they're not really interested in history and understand what I say. It's been that way since I published this back in 2014. I got a whole book on it. It's easy enough to read it, and I even have a chronology in the back if you need that as a crib. But no, like I said earlier, they're not really looking so much at the history while they're doing the science.
Yeah, yeah. I just mentioned that because I think that that could be maybe a further paper. Get to know your theory because there are dis if they distinguish between the image of Beirut, there are certain issues with that, which I think could be explained by saying, well, it's because Jack's theory is true. It wasn't in Beirut, it was in Antioch, and
Yeah.
that would better
Right.
perfectly fit the data.
And just to understand this too, Dale, there's no history of a cloth being in Beirut before the 8th century, before that conference. And it's everything that is told in that is essentially, again, a legend. It's something that supposedly the history is delivered through the mouth of this Jewish guy who owns these slats of boards and things like that. And he says, this is what happened in the past. I get this from my family, this, that, thing. It's not based on historical evidence at all. And I believe that the fellow that I think is promoting this, has been promoting is Caesar Barta, who's also not a historian, by the way.
Mhm.
But he's found a new translation of that sermon in which they no longer, in this translation, they no longer say it was a slat of boards. That however, they're treating some of the words in there. They're now saying that it was, some kind of a cloth. But I'm willing to accept that as a theoretical possibility. But again, I think the Beirut icon um, theory has less to go on than the Mandylian theory. At least the Mandylian theory has the legends. My theory is based on the history, and the Beirut theory is kind of based on neither up until the time they get to the 7th century. But be that as it may, I could respect if Fonte comes up with some findings, I could respect what they seem to tell the story. But I agree with you. There's not a heck of a lot of difference if you understand my hypothesis here. There's not a heck of a lot of geographical differences between my hypothesis and the Beirut icon hypothesis.
Yeah. It would just be based on the distinguishing between the length of time in those areas. And I think that
Right.
if they distinguish between that, I think this is my, again, I'm not a scientist or anything, but I think it could be used at the very least to say, yeah, Jack's right, actually. And
Yeah.
that could be confirmation. So, yeah, but,
Yeah,
you know,
I'd like to see him. have enough interest in what I've been doing for the past 40 years in this to at least talk to me. I sat next to him at the conference that we just had. He never mentioned a thing about this to me, but he could talk to me. He could read my book or what have you. But what I find, throughout this is that there are not a lot of people who are sold on the Mandylion being shroud who are really open-minded at all to it being anything else, anything other than that. Because I think they want to go into church groups and tell their whole history story in 5 minutes, and they don't want to take a couple of hours to tell any other story that would be more complicated than that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. So, yeah, happy to let you move on if you want.
Okay, sure.
All right.
So now we finally get, and I have the date right here. I transposed the one before. So this is going to be between 1001 and 1207.
All right.
Okay, next. So we're going to get into the 11th century. Next. Now, so we're starting where there's two relics, cloth relics, in gold cases, apparently, and both are located in the Imperial Bucolian Palace. The only thing we have on the Mandylion is we have two historical references to it. In the year 1036, there was a drought in Constantinople, and they had this procession to try to invoke God's grace to stop the drought. And it's reported that the Mandylion is carried in procession in Constantinople. Then in 1058, there is a Christian Arab writer reports that he saw the Mandylion in the Hagia Sophia Church. And Ian Wilson, who reported these sightings, says in 78, in none of these instances is there any suggestion of it, the Mandylion, being removed from its casket for exhibition. So go to the next slide. About the beginning, this comes from Wilson also, about the beginning of the 11th century, that's where we're at, a dramatic change in the representation of Jesus' burial occurred. So what is this change? What we have come on the scene is something called lamentation scenes. And art historians call these portrayals thranos, from the Greek word. Next slide, please.
Dranos with a D or?
I'm sorry, it's Threnos.
Okay.
Thranos.
All right.
And this is how Wilson describes them. The body of Christ is depicted at the foot of the cross after the crucifixion, lamented, that's why they're called lamentation scenes, by the holy women, while Joseph of Arimathea and Nicholas busy themselves with funeral arrangements. Next. So in this new motif, there's a pantocrator, the face of Jesus is a pantocrator face, like you started to see in the 6th century. He lies in death. His body is shown at full length. His right arm is folded over his left arm, precisely as is portrayed in the image of the Shroud of Turin. And what you're looking at here is an ivory dated to the early 11th century, which you can find at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So by this time, in the early 11th century, it seems to be known that there is an image of Jesus that is posed like this in depth. So these artworks um, show that if we go back to the history of things, that some emperor in the early 11th century decided that yes, the imperial covenant with God that Constantine the Fifth made, that we cannot have the relic itself viewed. It's okay for me as the emperor who has seen it to describe what that image is to artists who can then portray it in some kind of art form. Because there's no way that you get from the image of the shroud to these types of portrayals without somebody having seen it and have described it in full. And if you were looking at the shroud image and were looking at what it represents, other than the pantocrator type characteristics of the face, it's always the arms, the way that the arms are laid out and crossed. And that's what comes forward in these particular portrayals.
No, see, for us, the picture's blurry, so it's hard. I'm just, over his manhood and stomach, it looks like
Yeah.
there's something over that, but it looks like it almost extends beyond the body. So I'm just wondering, is there something covering him, but he's depicted as naked underneath
Yeah,
it?
well, no, they're certainly not going to portray him as completely naked and particularly in that area. I don't know what that is functionally supposed to be there, but I think it serves the purpose of hiding. It's almost as if okay, the first thing they did is bring Jesus down from the cross. They laid him on something, and they put something over his private parts at this time.
So
But I
that
think the important feature is that this is the way that even at that time, this artist pictures that they arranged his arms and hands, because that is what ends up um, on the image of the shroud.
Well, the reason I brought that up just quickly is because that might be, and again, it's blurry, so it's hard to tell. But
Yes, it is.
if they're putting something over Jesus, that would imply that they knew he wasn't wearing a loincloth up on the cross. He was
Right.
naked. So that could be another indication of, oh, well, they had the shroud and the shroud man's naked. So okay, we've got to put whatever this thing is
Right, right.
covering.
No, I would agree with you. This is where I think that when we get into artistic license, and you've got to consider the source, uh, it's Byzantine, and they were extremely modest. They were still portraying Jesus crucified on a cross with a full colobium, like a robe, into the 10th century. And so, no, they were not going to show Jesus in a fully naked form, especially, in his private areas at that time. But I think that the sense is, I mean, the question that has to be asked, and these are the questions that I've asked in the past of skeptics. Okay, explain this. Explain why there is the Latin sermon, and explain why there is a measuring cross. And you never get any answers. But why at this particular time? And remember, Dale, that this is early 11th century. So let's kind of pick a date. I'll pick 1108 just so it's even. In 988, we have the Latin sermon, which changes the Abgar legend and says that Jesus put his entire body on a white linen cloth and made an image of it for Abgar. This is, possibly less than 20 years later, and suddenly we have an image of Jesus after his crucifixion, in which his hands are in the same position as they are on the shroud. So I think what is happening at this time, little by little, the covenant to keep the secret about the shroud is becoming looser and looser, and the emperors now are just pushing it a little bit more and more. They can now say that there's a full image on a cloth, then they can now say this is what the image of the cloth on the cloth looks like without showing it to an artist. So I don't think that the artist who did this ever saw the shroud. I think this was described because I would have broken the covenant with God. I think it was just described to the artist by the emperor.
Okay. Do you okay, so that would cause I guess what I was trying to say is yeah, like he this Byzantine artist would have been told, I guess, about the shroud that oh and he's naked. Look, he's not wearing a loincloth or something. So the artist's like, well shoot, well I can't put him naked, but I can't put him with a loincloth, so I'll depict this thing covering him. But I
Yeah,
guess what
well,
that's
I agree with you, except I don't think it was his idea. I think it was the emperor's idea. I think the emperor said, I really want to show Jesus naked because this is what the image is, but we can't show him naked to the Byzantine people. So make sure you put something that covers,
that makes
you know,
sense. Yeah.
his private areas.
Perfect. All right, awesome.
All
Next
right.
next slide.
So next slide, please. Now, take a look at this slide and the next one, I think, but take a look at this one now. This is Jesus with the hands crossed in shroud-like manner, but he's standing up, not lying down. And it looks as if he's coming out of something. We'll just call it something for now. One would think that it would be his tomb that he was coming out of. But it's a different kind of portrayal now. It's not a lamentation portrayal where women are lamenting him, but it takes that lamentation format and it has Jesus standing up and he's arising from something that looks like theoretically it could be his tomb. Try the next slide.
Okay. And that's okay.
And these are Byzantine images going back to around the 11th century. Same sort of thing. It's a little bit different, in terms of the coloration. But again, the thing that he's coming out of is this. It's got kind of two levels. It's almost like a step up. And Jesus is again. He's got his head tilted to the right a little bit, and it's showing him probably in the process of resurrection at this time.
Is this in the background? Is this the cross meant to be the cross, the brown beam thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that seems to even have some writing on it.
Right.
It could be that they want to symbolize that this is after the crucifixion.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
your guess is as good as mine on that. Now, this is an actual painting from this era. It's actually been dated to the 11th century. It has nothing to do with the crucifixion, but what it portrays, it's a Byzantine, it's from the Campania school of Byzantine art, and it portrays Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman. That's right from scripture. And so that's Jesus on the left, that's the Samaritan woman on the right. And this is a well. This is a Byzantine well of the 11th century. And take a look at it here. It's got the two-step process at the bottom. And then it has the well coming up from those two steps. And so it would seem like if somebody really wanted to look around, which nobody's ever done, for what the artwork that's being done at the same time that for Byzantines are with the Jesus figure. Here's artwork with Jesus, which shows a Byzantine well. They didn't try to paint a well as it might have been, back in the first century in Judea. They put a Byzantine well there. So the story that I have for this is back in 2017, I attended the Pasco conference, the one that was run by Bob Rucker in Pasco, Washington. And at that time, there was a paper submitted by Emanuela Marinelli and some others. It was called The Mandylion in Constantinople. And the entire paper was about iconography and images of Jesus. Um, and when they got to the 11th century and they saw these images of Jesus coming out of this um, structure, this is what they say. I'm reading. Go to the next slide. I have it on there. Next slide. This is what they say. The depictions of Christ in the Constantinopolitan period, 944, 1204, go through a transformation. The image of the dead Christ with his arms crossed and his head bent on his right side begins to spread. Subsequently, the dead Christ appears to emerge from a tomb, which incomprehensibly, they say, resembles a well. Well, it's incomprehensible to them because Emanuela and the people she works with, they again are believers in the Mandylion theory, so they can't figure out how this art fits in with the Mandylion theory. And so if it doesn't fit in with the Mandylion theory, they don't want to find out anything more about it. Next slide. So that was the abstract. And in their paper, they said, in this iconographic type, Christ is depicted dead in a standing position with his arms crossed and his head reclined to the right. Subsequently, the representation of the dead Christ is accompanied by the presence of a structure similar to a grave, oddly resembling a well from which it appears to emerge. And the simple thing is, with any additional amount of research in the historical period, this should say from a well, because this is what Byzantine wells looked like at that time. But again, they're completely befuddled by what this iconography is supposed to be. Now, I think we just talked about it. If you go back and you get the Mandylion out of your mind for a minute, and you can get into your mind the Image of God Incarnate, which became the Sindon, which is really kind of what you would think that the Byzantines would be portraying at that time, the Sindon, in connection with the resurrection. You can remember that the legend, as we were just discussing with the Image of God Incarnate, also known as the image of Camilliana, is that that image itself was discovered in the village of Camilliana, per the legend, by a woman who was thinking about becoming a convert, but couldn't understand the concept of a God that you couldn't see, a material God. And she looks in her well, which is a Byzantine well because it's in Camilliana, in the 4th century, and she pulls the image of God incarnate out of the well. Now, if that image is the Shroud of Turin, that's what you're going to see. She's going to be pulling out of the well an image of Jesus rising out of the well. And the image is going to have Jesus as on the Shroud of Turin with his arms crossed. And so this iconography is not necessarily like they want it to be. Their mindset is it's Jesus arising from a tomb that looks incomprehensibly like a well, but it's the extraction of the image of God incarnate, the image of Camilliana, from the Byzantine well, per the legend. And so I think that this iconography is a message that the Sindon that we now have in the Imperial Relic Collection is the image that used to be called the image of God incarnate, which goes back through its legend to its founding as being discovered in a well. If you don't have that explanation, I would defy anyone to come up with an explanation for why Jesus is portrayed coming out of a well. I don't think there is one. And of course, if you're not reading my books, if you're not listening or learning a thing about my um, hypotheses about this, you don't know about the well. You don't know about the image of God incarnate. You're all you have in your mind is the image of Edessa Mandilian, and that has nothing to do with the Byzantine well. So you're just totally perplexed. I think that's what's happened with Emanuela Marinelli and the people who wrote this paper at that time.
Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me know when you're finished, and I have a couple questions.
Okay,
Okay.
let's see. Yeah, okay. Your questions.
Oh, okay. So just to clarify, so your theory. So at first I wasn't sure where you were going, but then yeah, it all made sense once you got to the obviously the legend of Kamaliana, which is became associated with the image of God incarnate. But just again to clarify, so when exactly was it that the image of God incarnate, the image, became associated with this image of Kamaliana legend? And if it was earlier to, I think we're in the 11th century, the 1000s AD, that these iconography started, and stuff like that, from what you're saying. So why, if it was associated with the legend of Kamaliana, before that, why is it taking until the 11th century for them to depict Jesus, this image coming out of the well? Why wasn't it before that?
Yeah, well, go back to your first question first. That this legend is the legend told in that uh, chronography that was published in 568. Um, and it was referring to the image of Jesus being created around Anatolia at the instruction of the emperor, Justinian the First. And then within 15 years of that, I think that the exhibition went until 560. And by 574, there's an actual historical report that this same image, the image that came from Kamaliana per the legend, that was now part of the imperial relic collection, and thereafter they began calling it the image of God incarnate. Now there was not a lot of uh, iconography that was being done regarding Jesus' body. If you remember, all of the Pantocrator images are almost entirely of the face, and I go into the reasons for that in my book of 2021, The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin, because the emperors would not have been depicting a naked body, even when they were doing crucifixes, which came about only after the shroud went to Constantinople, but where they were showing Jesus being crucified, he had to be fully clothed in that. In addition, the image of God incarnate was declared to be the palladium, the protective um, device that was going to protect Constantinople. And the image of Jesus on the shroud is not one of a victorious Jesus. It's pre-resurrection. It's the Jesus who's been arrested and tortured and crucified. And so that's not an image that you're going to be putting out there, as a palladium that's going to be carried around by your army to win victories. You're just going to take the face and you're going to put that on there. So um, there was just not at that time depictions of the body. I think that this is why the Emperor Justinian II in 692 called the church conference that passed that Canon 82 that said, henceforth, we should start portraying Jesus and showing his humiliation and his suffering. I think they did that because they had the perfect uh, image that would have shown that. But the emperor that was involved at that time, he got overthrown within 3 years, and that never came to be. And almost immediately after that, we got to this time of iconoclasm, where they couldn't show any images at all. And we finally get to 741, in which, from that point forward, the image itself is in its case, and it's not being shown to anyone other than the emperor. So I think you have to think about these icons in terms of the emperors who have knowledge that there is a full-size image of Jesus on this cloth. Little by little, century by century, they're letting out information about it. And you have Constantine VII saying it's a syndon, and then you have these lamentation uh, portrayals in which, okay, it's a full body and Jesus' hands are crossed. And I think it's in that kind of context that the information is coming out. They must be asking the emperor, where did this image come from? And he says, well, this is the image that we've had for many, many years. It's the image of God incarnate that we had for many years. The image that the legend said came out of a Byzantine well in Camiliana. And so at this time, the artists are all being directed by the emperors. They can't put anything out there that hasn't been approved by the emperors. And so I think it was the emperors trying to get across the idea that this image of Jesus with his hands crossed goes all the way back to the legend that itself goes back to the extraction of a full body image of Jesus from a Byzantine well.
Gotcha. All right. The other question, one last pro-shroud question, and then I'm going to turn into a shroud skeptic for my last
Sure.
question. But okay, so I'm kind of interested what this image of Jesus coming out of the well, like when I first saw the two images you showed, I went, oh, that's the Man of Sorrows icon. So I'm just kind of interested. What's the connection, if any, between the Man of Sorrows icon, where John Jackson says, well, this thing, it's just depicting a Byzantine device, and that's why it looks, Jesus has got his torso up to that point, and then it's blocked off. He would say, well, it's depicting the device of Jesus that it would raise out of. So what's the relation of the Man of Sorrows icon, if any, to this thing depicting Jesus?
Well, the Man of Sorrows icons, which are also, I think they're a little bit after this period. I think they become a little bit more 12th century than 11th century. But if you could Google it and you'll see that the Man of Sorrows, in many of the portrayals, does not have the crossed hands. It kind of looks like the Jesus that's coming out of the well, but it's not. They don't have the he's not portrayed with crossed hands. So I do think that's all part of this kind of motif that was developing at this time, in which maybe in order to stress Jesus' suffering, you got the Jesus kind of long faced and sometimes with blood on the face and the hair disheveled, and very very sorrowful, as if he's in the throes of his passion. But I kind of, if you take a look at the Man of Sorrows, most of those that I'm familiar with, Jesus' eyes are open, he's living, he's sorrowful because he's going through his passion. But they're not the lamentation which involves the dead Jesus, and they're not the Jesus that are coming out of this well in kind of a resurrection mode, so post suffering and death. I think that's the distinction. But they're all part of what is going on in Byzantine art in the 11th and 12th centuries.
Yeah, yeah, I think that was important, that these subtle nuances, because I remember listening to a presentation by Shroud skeptic Nicholas Allen, and he just kind of lumps them all together and says, well, this is just how they were depicting it in this style and stuff like that during this period, and he doesn't distinguish between,
Right, right. And just like I said with Fonte before, Allen is what? He's the photographer, right?
yeah, proto
So,
photo.
shoemaker makes shoes. I mean, I'll listen to what he says on the photography. I'm not really that interested in what he's saying on the history because he's not reading the stuff. He's not reading any historical text. He's looking at a couple of pictures from a Byzantine icons, and he may not know the Man of Sorrows from the Lamentations. So,
What? Okay. Well, sorry, I'm interested in this, but just another follow-up, if you don't mind.
sure, no, no, go, go.
Now, I'm kind of interested because Nicholas Allen, when you look at his credentials, he's a professor of history. He's not a scientist, but he's a professor of history and the history of technology or something like that. So
Yeah.
you would think he would have some more contributions when it comes to like history and stuff. But
If
yeah,
he's really interested in history, but history of technology tells me that he might be more interested in technology. I mean, I was a lawyer for most of my career. I could tell you some things about the history of law, but that doesn't make me a historian.
yeah.
There are people that come out in shroud world who are numismatics and they know coins, and you see them give presentations or write papers on coins that have images of Jesus. And they're very good in terms of the coins when they were manufactured, what they were trying to accomplish there. But then they go out into the history of what was happening at that time. They don't have the foggiest. They're, you know, as I said, I kind of believe what Paulo Diaz-Azaro has been preaching for a while, and that's shoemaker make your shoes. And when it comes to the history, you should really be trying to get your information from the people who have devoted their life to the history. That's why I don't get very much involved with science. I know a lot of it. I read almost everything there is about shroud science, but it's not my field. And I'm not going to venture opinions out there where there are people who would have knowledgeable opinions. And I received my knowledge in history by reading and researching. These people, very many of them, they don't do any reading, they don't do any researching. They kind of get the cliff notes. They watch some videos, they pick up a few points, and but they're not doing a study of iconography. And the strange thing too is that, as I said here, um, Emanuele Marinelli is very good at iconography. She's kind of been an expert at it for years, but she's approaching it from the standpoint of everything that's involving the shroud is the shroud being the mandilion. And if it doesn't fit that format, then she's not considering anything outside of that. And there are historians that are doing the same thing. They'll pick up history information, like they'll find out about the loris, and they'll publish an article that says the loris represents the shroud, and it goes back to the 5th century in Constantinople. And so you say, okay, that's all very good, but where was the shroud then in the 5th century if it wasn't in Constantinople? Where was it? Oh, it was in Edessa. Well, they didn't wear lorises. They weren't changing their clothing to fit something that represented the shroud. Where are you coming from? They just don't even think through this stuff. They're just trying to reinforce this idea that they already have, that the shroud is the image of Edessa or the Mandilium, whatever you want to call
All right, awesome. So my last question, I'm gonna have to channel my inner Hugh Ferry here, and
it. Mm-hmm.
I wish I could do the accent, but I butcher it. So, but look, I can picture a shroud skeptic like Hugh Ferry, coming back and saying, "Well, we don't need to appeal to the shroud or someone, the emperor, seeing the shroud images to picture Jesus coming out of the well and associating it with the legend of Camiliana. What it is obviously, look, in the Bible, Jesus is known as he is as this everlasting water. You will never thirst after you drink of him and stuff like that. So it's just symbolically depicting Jesus as the fountain of eternal life, and you'll never thirst again once you drink from the water that he brings and stuff like that. So there's no need to appeal to the legend of Camiliana here.
Okay.
What would you
So
say?
I might say to my friend Hugh, could you cite me to some other images of Jesus coming out of water? I mean, coming out of the resurrected Jesus coming out of a lake, or a river, or something. If you're trying to make the point that it has a reference to the water, then where other than in these particular uh, icons do you see Jesus coming out of something at least connected with water? In this case, I mean, and you're right. He might say something like that, but it's kind of things that drive me crazy with these skeptics. They'll come up with uh, a lot of broad things. The question that has to be turned on them. So if you're playing Hugh, I'll ask you to answer my question. Why
Oh, you got cut off.
a Byzantine well of all the Byzantine well?
Sorry, Jack, you got cut off there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
But
said,
just before you repeat yourself, Hugh Ferry, this is a challenge because I know you'll be writing a blog responding to Jack's case here. So answer this, what Jack's going to ask you here.
yeah. So the question is, if he were to say what you just said, if you were actually channeling your inner Hugh Farry here, I would just be saying to him, there are a lot of ways to portray Jesus coming from living waters. Um, and I guess you could do it in the motif of his resurrection after his crucifixion, although I've never seen any. But in this particular case, this is made by a Byzantine artist at the time that knowledge of the shroud image is becoming broader and broader. And in this case, it shows Jesus coming out of a Byzantine well. My answer is it's because the cloth is the cloth that came out of a Byzantine well per the legend. What's your explanation? Why a Byzantine well? Get specific.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. And I predict Hugh will not be able to answer that, but over to
No,
you.
it's like what you run into with not only with these skeptics, but you run into it with these people that always push the Mendelian theory. You can ask them a million questions. If they don't have an answer, they'll just ignore you. They'll just kind of go away, and nothing is resolved intellectually. It's just that, yeah, I guess you got me there, or no, I don't have an answer for that. And remind me not to go on the same program with you again. I don't want you asking me questions like this.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, cool. Well, yeah, that's it for my questions there. So I'll
Sure.
let you
Okay,
go.
I think we can move on then.
Just out of curiosity, how did I do as a Hugh? Was I a good Hugh Fairy
Yeah,
or
that's typical of the Hugh Farry. You and I did a couple of programs with him, and during these programs, he hardly ever asked me any questions. And then we kind of finished the last show, and actually, I got ill at that time. I was ill for over a month at that time. He started writing blogs, and he's raising points that he never raised while we were talking about it. So I don't know. He either gave second thought or somebody was giving him information. But all the questions are, they're general in form. If I think in the last one I did something about the Latin sermon. I give all the reasons why it just has to be a reference to the shroud. And he'll say something like, no, there's other explanations for that. And that's it. See, if we were debating, I would say, well, tell me what the other explanations are. Let's discuss them, let's debate them, or what have you. But I never know what the other explanations are. He'll say the hymn of the pearl is not a reference to the shroud. And you say, well, then what is it a reference to? Why specifically is a friend of King Abgar the Great? Why is he writing this? If he hasn't seen the shroud, why is he writing about this image in the hymn of the pearl? And you'll never get that. It'll be, oh, well, it's a reference to the King of Kings. It doesn't have to be Jesus. It could be to, some powerful potentate from the East. Well, which potentate? And who's writing about the King of Kings as the potentate? You never get any of this type of detail. There's nothing other than kind of general objections to what the authenticist line is in terms of the history. I mean, I've been around doing this 40 years, and I've never seen a single one of them ever asked a direct question that really couldn't be answered, and more or less even turned on them to answer another question that would have to explain their position. That's why you don't get any volunteers for participating in these panel discussions and the debates that would be over a specific theory, like the shroud did not exist or the shroud was the Mandillion. I mean, that's what I think you and I tried to do when we put this together, and we
Yeah.
we didn't get very much participation.
Yeah. 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 They don't want to be pinned down to like making clay. They just keep it very vague and generalized so that,
Yeah,
they expect you to be pinned down on the Pro-Shroud side. So then they can nitpick this or that element of it.
right.
But yeah,
And I don't mind being pinned down. I mean, I get pinned down a lot, and I like you're asking me questions. I'll give you my answers. I don't mind being pinned down. I don't mind defending my position. But when you turn it on them and you want to ask the proponents of the Mandillian theory to explain how they can justify this, that, or the other thing, they'll come on and they'll say they discovered the Mandillion in the wall, after the flood. And then you'll say, what text is that from? They don't have any text. It doesn't exist. Doesn't this doesn't this isn't this refuted by the same legend that put it in the wall in the first place? They don't know. They never even read the legend through. They just have their talking points, and they go on. They keep talking to each other about it. It's like self-affirmation that goes on.
yeah, yeah. I'm still hoping like once we're done with your presentations and stuff like that, that maybe I can find some because I know Mark Guskin has agreed in principle. He's like, yeah, once you're done with your solo presentations, at least he's willing to
That's good.
discuss it and stuff. So, yeah, I'm hoping that after we finish the solo things, we can actually set up that discussion because it's so
Well,
crucial.
that's what academics and intellectual discussions all about. You're going to find people that don't agree, or they've got new ideas or better ideas, and I don't mind at all dealing with those people. But then they have to defend what their position is. If they don't like my position, then what is their position? And then let them defend their position. I mean, I've asked these people for years, just show me some historical evidence that supports that the shroud was once the image of Edessa. Don't give me any legendary evidence. Don't give me things that are speculation that have been made up. Just give me something solid. And they'll say, for example, well, how about these Pantocrator images? Don't you think they're of the shroud? And I say, yes. Don't you think they came from the shroud? I say, yes. So it's the image of Edessa, right? No, it's the image of Camilliana. It was around at the same time. It was in Constantinople where they were making these images.
Mhm.
So what do you have to say about that? They have nothing to say about it. They can't say anything about it. It is what it is.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, cool. Well, I'll let you get back into it.
All right, next one, I guess.
Okay. Oh, here we go.
So I'm not going to cover this in the detail that I would, but I did mention before what I call it's the second most important text in Shroud history. It's the Tarragona manuscript because we're now in the um, 11th century. We're toward the end of it. This is a manuscript that was written somewhere between 1075 and about 1095. It was written in Constantinople by a person then living in Constantinople. Next slide. And this is just, these are the texts that I think are the most important in Shroud history. I've mentioned to you the Chronicle Pseudo-Zachariah. That tells us that the Shroud, left Antioch and went to Constantinople. We have this one, which explains what happened to the Shroud after 741 because it was placed in a case and withheld from public view. And then you have Constantine's harangue, which we talked about, because that's where it's acknowledged that there's a syndon in the imperial relic collection. And then you have the Latin sermon, which says that there is a cloth that has a full image of Jesus' body on it. So I consider these to be the four most important. And we're going to just deal a little bit with the second one, the Tarragona manuscript. Next slide. Okay, so it's thought that this is written by a pilgrim to Constantinople, or perhaps a student who's taking language instructions in Greek. This person writes a letter home, and he's telling his family and friends what a beautiful place Constantinople is, all the wonders that it has, and it gets to this point in the text. There is in the same glorious city the shape or form of the visage or appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ on a linen cloth made by Jesus himself. Next slide. King Abgar was in the city burning with great desire to see the beautiful face. It uses the word facium, meaning face, of our Lord Jesus. Jesus knew of the king's desire and so took a linen cloth and wrapped, emphasis on that, his face in it. The form and figure of his visage, vultus is the Latin word, not the form and figure of his facium, face, was imprinted onto the cloth. Next. And Jesus says to Abgar, but if you desire to see my face physically, I will send you a linen. Oh, this is the Latin sermon. I'm trying to show how much the Tarragona manuscript now tracks the Latin sermon that was written 100 years before that. Okay. In the Latin sermon, Jesus is saying the same thing. If you desire to see my face, I'll send you a linen, and you'll not only be able to see the form of my face, but more readily the divinely transformed state of my body. And then Jesus spreads his body, and the noblest state of his entire body is transfigured onto the linen. This is the version of the Abgar legend that the writer of the Tarragona manuscript is kind of modeling his text after. Next. And note again that why in the world is he using the word wrapped in terms of the formation of the image? If you see all the former Abgar legends, it's Jesus is washing his face and then drying it with the cloth, or he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's wiping off the sweat. But it's specifically wrapped. And where do we find the word wrapped? If you go to the 3 synoptic gospels, when it's talking about Jesus' body, each one of them uses a Greek term for the word wrapped. Jesus was wrapped in his syndon. So the author uses that word. And remember, he is, basically reporting what he's heard. He's in Constantinople. He's aware that there's an image in the imperial relic collection, and he can only tell you what he's heard. So let's go on with what he says about it. He says, this wonderful linen cloth with the visage, again, the visage is the appearance of Jesus, marked by direct contact, is kept with greater veneration than the other relics in the palace. So that would include the crown of thorns and some of the more other famous Byzantine relics. And it's held in such esteem, it's always kept in a golden case and very, very carefully wrapped up. Next.
Locked up, yeah.
And when all of the other palace relics are shown to the faithful at certain times, this linen cloth on which the visage of our Redeemer is depicted is not shown to anyone and is not opened up for anyone except the Emperor of Constantinople. So only the emperor gets to see this. And why? Why is this so special? Why is it so different? Next. And before we go into this, just know that by this time, of course, the Mandylion is known as the Mandylion. If he wants to describe the Mandylion, he can just say there's a Mandylion relic. He can say that there's a relic that used to be the former image of Edessa. He can say, this is the relic that was brought to Constantinople in 944. or he could say this is the relic that's hanging in the Pharaoh's chapel. He doesn't say any of those things that would describe the Mandylion. It's something different than the Mandylion. So back to what he says, he's now giving the history of this cloth that's there. It was locked away in a golden case, carefully sealed up, and then the earthquakes stopped. These were the continuous earthquakes from 741, and the heaven sent ill ceased. And from that time on, from 741, no one has dared open the case or see what might be inside it, as everyone believes and fears that if anyone tries to open it, the whole city will be struck by another earthquake. So this is the promise that was made to God back in 741. The emperors are still very fearful that if they make the cloth known, if they make the shroud known, then the earthquakes are going to start again, or God's going to somehow punish the city in some other way. And this is why all they're doing is they're kind of dropping hints as to what the image on the cloth looks like. Okay, next. And it says the case that stored the object used to be held open, but the whole city was struck by continuous earthquakes. Everyone was threatened with death, and a heavenly vision revealed that the city would not be freed of such ill until such time as the linen cloth with the Lord's visage, again on it, visage, should be locked up and hidden away far from human eyes, and so it was done. So this explains why the shroud from 741 was not really known to be a shroud, because only the emperor knew that it was a shroud, and there were reasons why the emperor would not tell anybody about it, including the fact that maybe the early emperors felt just even talking about the image might have incurred God's wrath again. But I think in this paper or in an earlier presentation, I mentioned that Robert Drews, who's a professor of history, when he wrote about the shroud, he said that the emperors would not have revealed the presence of an image on a burial cloth, because the people would have then clamored to see it, would have been reviled. The Byzantines would have been reviled by the damage that it showed to Jesus' body, the nakedness and all that, and that they could have very well had a riot on their hands. So all this kind of worked into what the imperial policy was in terms of keeping the people's support and keep them from becoming upset. Next. Before we get into the 12th century, just to finish up with this, the Mandylion, the other cloth that was there present in the relic inventory at that time, there's never a report that that cloth was locked away by a Byzantine emperor. So this story that's being told in the Tarragona manuscript has never been told vis-a-vis the Mandylion. And there's only one single, if you look at the history of earthquakes in Constantinople, and there's a very fine paper on that by Glanville Downey, you find out that from the time that the Mandylion, the image of Edessa, got to Constantinople in 944, there were no continuous earthquakes at all during that period of time. In fact, there was only really one earthquake, that was in 989, and that was just a simple earthquake. It was not continuous in any way. And that emperor in 989 was not an iconoclast, so he would not have connected an earthquake or ending an earthquake with the fact that an image was being shown.
And just a quick, easy question, but just that word visage, like for visage, when I hear that, I for whatever reason I associate that with like the full body images, but could that word also be equally used for just the facial?
It could, you know, if you look up the definitions, visage could also mean the face, but that's why I showed that this writer, when he wants to use face, he uses fascium. And so when he's talking about the facial image, he could just have said that it has an image of the face. And at that point, he's only quoting what the Abgar legend uh, said, that Abgar wanted to see the face of Jesus. But then he chooses an entirely different word when he's talking about the cloth itself. He's not using fascium anymore. There'd be no reason why, if he was talking about an image of the face, he just wouldn't continue to use the word fascium. So why is he using visage when visage also can be a word to mean the face, and it can also be a word to mean the entire body appearance? He uses visage, and there's no distinction drawn between the two of them by people who have uh, looked at this manuscript before. I only know of two people who have done that. One is Mark Guskin, who you mentioned, and of course, he's a supporter of the Mandelian theory, and he wants to interpret this in a way in which they are talking about the Mandelian. And for a translator, he's not even taking note of the changes in the terms or why they are, or why the terms have changed. On the other hand, Andrea Nicolati, who's a skeptic, when he talks about this particular manuscript, he translates it in a way in which he takes the word, I think it's called lentiola, if I remember correctly, but it's merely a reference to the linen, and he talks about it being a small linen cloth rather than just the linen, because he also wants it to be the Mandelian, because he knows the Mandelian existed, but he doesn't think the shroud existed. So, you've kind of got both translators with their own personal views and agenda regarding this. And again, I like to point out that there is a difference, and have people argue, just like you asked, well, what is the meaning of this word? Could it mean something else? What is it? I would like to see this text be more certain and use the word body rather than visage. I think they would like to see it read fascium throughout, so it would just be the face. But you got this word visage, which can mean both. And if you're not talking about the Mandelian, and there are reasons why I've already said to you that it could not be the Mandelian. I'll give you one more before we finish. But if it's not the Mandelian, then what is the cloth that they're talking about? We only know of one other cloth in the Imperial Relic Collection that it could be, and that's the Sindon, which Constantine VII acknowledged was there. And so if it's the Sindon, then when they're talking about there being a visage and the word is getting out. I don't think this pilgrim or student ever saw the object itself. They're repeating a story which they heard. But the story that he is hearing, that this writer is hearing, is that there's a cloth. It's more valuable than all the other relics, held in the highest of esteem, and it has a visage of Jesus on it, and he doesn't say that it's a face cloth. So I just don't understand why, even if they would find it debatable and they're willing to debate it, why not mention the other part of the debate? It's agenda oriented. All the writings are agenda oriented to get to what their end result is. For skeptics, there's no shroud. For supporters of the Mandelian theory, it's the Mandelian. Okay, I'm willing to say it doesn't have to be the Sindon, but my God, how do you explain the history of the continuous earthquakes when Constantinople had only one earthquake after 944, and it was not a continuous earthquake, but there is a reported earthquake from 741 in which it was continuous for a year, and you had an iconoclastic emperor? How do you answer those questions? At some point you have to use your intelligence and reasoning and come to some kind of conclusion that's at least based on the evidence that you have.
Yeah, based on the contextual indicators and
Exactly.
stuff. So,
And one other thing about it is that remember that one of the quotes I read said it hasn't been viewed Whatever that cloth did, it hasn't been viewed by anyone other than the Byzantine emperor. Well, Gregory Referendarius saw the cloth. He wasn't an emperor. He described what he saw. It was a reflection imprinted only by the sweat falling like drops of blood. He saw it. You have all those Byzantine Mandylion renderings from the 10th and 11th century. You know, at least some of them probably were able to look at the Mandylion itself at that time. So, it just, if that's the history that nobody has seen it but the emperor, and it came from a time where there were continuous earthquakes, it just doesn't match up with the Mandylion. But it would match up with the image of God incarnate, which was in Constantinople at 741, and which must have, once it was placed in the case, it must have been what was referred to as the Sindon, beginning with Constantine VII.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right. Awesome.
Okay.
12th century. So this is the 1100s now.
Yes. So now we're moving into the 1100s. This is the century before the shroud is exhibited in Constantinople. All right. Now, go to the next slide, please, Dale. So now we have to get to a minute here with the part of the Mandylion theory. And remember, Wilson has asked an awful lot of his readers. He's asked them to believe that the shroud was folded into four. No evidence of that, really. Certainly not anything from the beginning centuries, the tetradiphon that comes about in the 7th century. He asked them to believe that it was taken to Edessa, when every academic historian says there wasn't any Christian activity in Edessa until the 2nd century. And so at this point in time, the Mandylion theory has the shroud in the Pharos Chapel, and it's just a facial image as far as everybody there is concerned. So now he wants you to make another assumption, and this is the assumption, and he uses the same kind of qualifying language that he has throughout. Someone seems to, really, have undone the gold trellis work covering the cloth, untwined the fringe from the surrounding nails, carefully unfolded the cloth, and for the first time since the days of the apostles, set eyes on the concealed full-length image. Now, he has to come up with an explanation, because as you'll see in this 12th century, we begin to get a number of reports that there are two distinct relics in the collection. One is what would be the Mandylion, and one would be the Sindon. And the Mandylion is a representation of Jesus' face, and the Sindon is something that covered his body. And so how could the Mandylion be the shroud when the Sindon is listed separately? Well, this is the explanation. It's a seems to explanation, not supported by anything. That somebody went in, finally discovered after all these centuries that there was a body image folded up under the Mandylion. And let's go to the next slide. And again, this is a quote. What seems to have happened, here we got another seems, is that a copy of the original form of the Mandylion was introduced into the collection. In other words, they now knew that they had the shroud, but they didn't want to just admit that the shroud was the Mandylion, and so they made a copy of the Mandylion, and that's what is now in the gold box holding the Mandylion. And then this copy is now no longer on the right-hand side of the Pharos Chapel facing east, but it's twinned with the Karamean. That's the brick that has an image of Jesus. And now both of those things are hanging from the center of the chapel by heavy silver chains. There's absolutely no documentation whatsoever. There's no proof whatsoever that anything like this transpired. Go to the next slide, please.
Okay. So just a point of clarification, and just to make sure I and the audience are understanding. So, at some point in the 1100s, randomly, just on an ad hoc basis, someone undid all of the things with the Mandy line and discovered it was the burial shroud of Christ.
That's what
And
seems to have happened.
what seems to have happened. So,
Yeah,
but and because of this, they're like, okay, well, we want to start showing the full burial shroud of Christ, but we don't want to reveal that it was actually the Mandy line. So they forged up a fake copy of just the facial image of the Mandy line and
yeah.
showed that.
Well, no, they didn't show that. They never showed that. They just did it. This is not
Oh,
my theory. This is Wilson's theory. They did it, and they made up a fake Mandillion, and they placed it back into the box where the Mandillion would be. I don't think they did it because they wanted to show the shroud at that time. I just think that they knew that they wanted to make a representation that that they had a shroud in the imperial collection. They wanted to make it clear that they had a shroud in the imperial collection, which the emperors knew at least as far back as Constantine VII. But yeah, I mean, this is what they said. Why they did it and why they did it this way, um, who knows? As I'm about to point out here, can I finish answering your question? If we can just go a slide or two because it might answer your question.
yeah, yeah, no problem.
Okay. Okay. So this again is a quote from Wilson. This seems to be the only explanation, seems to be, and the only explanation for the mysterious way in which, from the late 11th century on, burial linens are recorded in the collection of the Constantinople, while a mandillion is also recorded as an independent object. Now go to the next slide. Oops, that doesn't look right.
Hmm.
Uh-oh. I'm
Yeah.
having a problem on my end. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there.
History of
Um,
Orticus Vitalis is,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I see what happened. You're fine. I don't have this as a slide. Um, so Wilson says that's the only explanation. Why, when everything is said and done, there's a reference to a Mandillion and a reference to a burial cloth, and that's the only way that he can explain it. But there's a better way and an easier way to explain why there are two objects. It's because there were two objects. There was a Sindon and there was a Mandillion. And, if you go down to Occam's razor and you apply that, where you apply no more assumptions that should be made than are necessary, you don't have to make these assumptions that somebody discovered a body image and then they decided they were going to replace it and this is what we did. The easier explanation is that these were two separate cloths from the very beginning and always were. The Mandillion was never the shroud. They each got to Constantinople at different times, but then they both ended up together in the Imperial Relic Collection. And so you have two cloths. Why do you have to go through all these contortions and make all of these assumptions? Because you're not really doing it to explain the presence of two independent claws. What you're doing, the only reason it's necessary to do this is to allow the Mandillion hypothesis to remain viable. Because as soon as it becomes accepted as it's reported that there are two separate claws, a Mandillion and a Sindon, then the Mandillion cannot be the Sindon. So this is just all a distortion, uh, additional speculation to explain something that otherwise would not be explainable.
Yeah, it's the very definition of ad hoc. It violates Occam's razor.
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Uh,
I want to say that Wilson is honest. He's not lying about this. If I write and I put things seems to, and as he does in other parts where he says, well, we can only imagine, or perhaps, I mean, these are just assumptions that you're asking your readers to make. But what's happened over the years, because at one time this was the only explanation for what Shroud history was about. These people have made all these assumptions. They go out and make presentations now in which, let's say, what we just went over. They'll say the Mandillion was substituted. There was a substitute Mandillion at some point. And then, an audience of naive people are going to say, okay, well, I'll buy that. But if you're looking at it as history, show what is the historical basis for making this claim. There's absolutely none. You're only making this assumption for the convenience of allowing the theory to go forward from that.
yeah, it's solely made for the purpose of explaining the later text, which even Ian Wilson is admitting are clearly differentiating these two
Yes,
objects.
right.
But if you, I would also even argue it's implausible. Like what is the historical plausibility? Why would they make up this mock object? It's kind of the questions I was asking you, and I guess Ian Wilson, he's nobody on the pro Image of Edessa side has tried to come up with a plausible explanation as to why, as of the early 1100s, would they make this fake thing once they discovered it.
Right, right. I do think, and this is just from my memory, it's been a while since I looked at it. I think Wilson does have some sort of explanation, but again, it's not based on it. That his explanation, as I recall, is that by this time, uh, the idea that there was a Mandillion had uh, been in the people's heads. And remember, the Mandillion was, supposedly formed in one of two ways, either by Jesus washing his face or wiping blood off his face. But those are the stories that have been put out to the Byzantines at this time. And that essentially, I think his explanation is that the emperors did not want to go back and say, well, we either lied to you before or we didn't know what we were talking about before. So they actually created this fake Mandillion so they didn't have to do that. Probably nobody would ever be able to see it again. I don't know how fake it was or how good they were able to do, but because it never was revealed again. As you know, the Sindon was brought out and exhibited at St. Mary of Blachernay's Church during the Crusades, but the Mandillion wasn't. The Mandillion remained in its box. Robert de Clary said that. So nobody ever really saw the Mandillion again. And, it's not necessarily criminal because nobody really saw the Mandillion from the time it got to Constantinople until it left Constantinople. It's sort of always remained in that box. I think it just wasn't that impressive, and that's why it was not really exhibited. But they were safe. They could put in a phony. I don't even know why Wilson needs to say they put something phony in there. They could just have the empty casket and tell
That's
everybody that the Mandillion was still in there, right?
That's what I was just going to say. There are equally probable, or I would argue more probable, conjectures one can make, such as the one you just made, or
Yeah,
heck, even this is the Byzantine Empire in the medieval period. Just say, well, look, this is the Mandelian, but a miracle happened, and the facial image transformed into a
yeah,
full body image. The people would believe that, and
yeah,
it'd be even more amazing. So, like. Yeah, I just don't buy that on my
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I can still say, as I did back in the 900s, that if they had ever, even at this time in the 12th century, if they had said, "Hey, we have a Sindon with an image on it," the people are going to clamor to see the image, and it would still probably cause the same problems for the emperors as it would have before. You got to remember when it's finally brought out for the public, Constantinople is on the verge of being conquered. And so I think that, and they had this crazy emperor at this time, which we'll get to that part of the story. But it wasn't until then, under those exigent circumstances, that you had the shroud actually revealed. So it's around this time, we're in the 1100s, and this is when the history of Ordericus Vitalis appears. And basically, he takes the Abgar legend that was retold in the Latin sermon in 988, and he just puts it in the legend. Same thing. Jesus sent him a letter, and then Jesus sent him this cloth on which he had wiped the sweat of his face, and now we'll just add to it, which also shows the appearance of the volume of the body of the Lord to those who observed it. So it's really kind of getting put out there now, not only in the art, but also in the text, that there is a cloth that has Jesus' entire body image in it. They're not saying that it's his crucified body image, but they're just saying that it's a full body image. It's kind of strange because Wilson says this is the first indication that the mandillion had been replaced with a phony mandillion, because it's really not. It's the first textual indication, but the art had indicated that for a long time. So I'm not sure why Wilson's revised theory doesn't have the discovery of the image much closer to those times when the lamentation art came about. But anyway, that is what he says about it. Next. Oh, I'm having a problem with my slides here. I don't know what's going on here.
Is it out of our two distinct cloth relics?
All right, I'm going to just go through the slides that we have here. So we have two distinct cloths now. How do we know there are two distinct cloths? There's in 1150, an unknown English pilgrim says that the collection contains the sidarium that was over Jesus' head. That was the shroud that came over his head, and the mantili or mantili, which applied to the Lord's face, retained the image of his face. So two relics. Next. 7 years later, an Icelandic abbot says that the emperor owns both the sidarium, which was over Jesus' head, same description as the earlier one, and the mantili, which our Lord held to his face and on which the image of his face was preserved. Two different objects, one the face, one went over his body. Still not saying anything about a full body image on the relic, but nobody's seeing it. It's, again, these people are reporting what they've been told. Next. Hold on for just 1 second. I'm catching up here on this other one.
You want me to go back?
Okay, I'm finally caught up here. Okay, the next one is this one. Okay. All right, I'm with you now. Then there's an imperial relic inventory taken in 1190, and that lists both the Sindon and the Tau sent to King Abgar by the Lord, on which the Lord by his own doing is transferred as an image. Okay, two separate objects. It continues through 1190 to the next slide.
Okay. Just so to the word towel, is that significant?
Yeah, I think that would be the mandillion, the mantille. So I think it's saying, let's put it this way, we know it's a smaller cloth sent to King Abgar by the Lord, on which the Lord is transferred as an image. So he's not transferring an image of his body onto a towel.
Gotcha.
And the Sindon is listed separately than that.
All right.
All right. And then in 1200, there's a pilgrim, Antonius of Novgorod, and he says the imperial relic collection contains both the lintium, which is really the linen, and the linteum, the linen, representing the face of Christ. Again, two separate objects. Next. And now we have Nicholas Masoretes, the custodian of the imperial relic collection. Now, what has happened clearly by this time is that the emperor, who is basically an evil, crazy emperor, we'll get to that, Alexios, he has essentially given the green light for the Sindon to be taken out of its case and to be put in the relic collection with the other relics. No longer, this is not a guy who was concerned about the covenant made with God or the effects of what might happen if you broke it. And so Nicholas Masoretes says in 1201 that in the Pharaoh's chapel, they have both the burial cloths of Christ and also a towel, I guess that's Kiramonteon, bearing a prototypal image of Jesus on it as if by some art of drawing not wrought by hand. So again, this is a description of the Sindon and a description of the towel or the mandilion as two separate objects in the Pharaoh's chapel at this time, 1201.
Okay, and why is it cloths or sindons plural? Is that mean there's at least three things? Of what is
Well,
there?
I think that if you look at the entire text of what Masoretes is saying, that there were other burial cloths. They had other linens, which they interpreted as being linens from Jesus' tomb. You know, it's kind of like St. John described the Athania that was in the tomb, you know, the various linens.
Mhm.
Peter and John bent down and they saw the linens which were lying on the ground. So the Byzantines were kind of representing that they had the burial linens, plural, that would have included the Sindon, but it wasn't just limited to that. In fact, let me just see. I thought I had another slide here. Yeah.
As you're looking for that. So just to clarify, is not necessarily saying it's not saying, oh, we have two or more full burial shroud
No,
cloths. It's
no,
one burial shroud cloth and maybe the binding strips is what
right,
it's
right.
okay.
Yeah, it could have been any of those things. And I think that I thought I had it here, but this is kind of the Masoretes goes on to say they seem to be of a cheap variety and they still have the smell of myrrh on them. So he's obviously looking at and referring like to a group of linens that they must have contended at the time were all the burial linens of Jesus from the tomb. But the important part here is that whatever they were, they're separate and apart from the towel that has the image of Jesus, which would be the mandilion.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we'll go next.
Yeah, and one last point I'll just say about that too is obviously it wouldn't be when Nicholas is looking at this, it wouldn't be two or more full cloths because then they would go, well, obviously you didn't have two burial shrouds, so which
Yeah.
one would be which. So yeah, that supports your view that maybe it's binding strips or something along
Yeah,
those.
and I'm taking this from somewhere. I'm not exactly sure. It might be from the original text, but I have the burial clothes syndones, which is the way they had it in the text. So the translator is translating syndones as clothes in this. So it's various cloths that are there rather than the single cloth of the shroud itself.
Gotcha. All right. There you go.
All right, then we get to Robert de Clary,
Everyone's favorite.
and he says in his memoir that the Emperor of Byzantine, while he was there in 1203, 1204, was in possession of both a sindon bearing a full length image of Jesus' body. He goes through that description that's shown at the church. And he also says that there's separately a cloth bearing an image of Jesus' face, and that's the cloth that he has said, I quoted him earlier, is still in a case and hanging from the ceiling of the Pharaoh's chapel.
Yeah. And this was written right before the Fourth Crusade, right before they invaded the city of
Right,
Constantinople.
right before they did their sack. The Fourth Crusade arrived in Constantinople in July of 1203. They had made a deal with the son of the imprisoned emperor, the one who had been deposed by his brother, that if the crusade took him to Constantinople and reinstated his father, that his father would then finance the crusade, which wanted to go on to the Holy Land. And so they got him there, and they threw out the king, the emperor that was there, who was a usurper at that time. And then they said, "Now pay us." And he said, "Well, just wait. We gotta get things organized there. We haven't been, ruling. Give us some time." So they waited and waited and waited. And while they were waiting, the Crusaders were going into the city and touring the city. Everybody was friendly. And this is when, according to De Clary, that some of the Crusaders would go to the Church of St. Mary in Blachernay, and every Friday they would see standing up straight a figure of Jesus on a cloth that could be plainly seen. And so De Clary is talking about that cloth being exhibited every Friday, and he's also saying there is also in the Farris Chapel hanging in a gold case from the ceiling. There's this other object, which is the object in which Jesus left an image of his face. So he's another one that's saying there are two separate objects. Now, remember, Wilson would say, "Oh, I'm fine with this because the object that is lying in the case in the Farris Chapel is a fake Mandillion." But if you're just going to go by the text without the theory and without the imaginations that go with it, there's obviously two important relics, and they both exist separately from each other at the same time.
One thing I'm just wondering to help Ian Wilson, I should have asked this back when we were going over this, but I'm just wondering, like, could Ian Wilson modify his theory in saying, okay, let's forget about supposing that they actually made a fake cloth. Let's do, what Jack proposed. They didn't make a cloth, but they just claimed there was one in there. That would could that be a bit more plausible
I think it would be. I think it would be a bit more plausible. Yeah, I mean,
and
quite
it would
frankly,
still
I do, but I don't know what all of his thinking was. He may not have been thinking strictly along the terms of resolving the problem of the two separate objects. Um, I think that because he gave, as I recall, his reason that he wanted the emperor wanted the people of Byzantium to believe that this other object still existed. Maybe the idea was, well, if they clamor too much one day, we're going to have to show them something, and they've never really seen it. It hasn't been out in the open for 300 years, so we can show them just about anything. They might not even think that's really that impressive, but at least they won't know that we lied to them. So I don't know. I think that when you're doing a hypothesis, you're trying to write it around. It should be written around all the known facts, and to solve whatever problems, anticipating the questions that might be asked about it, and to solve all these problems. But yeah, I do think that this is. I think there are a number of things contrived in the Mandillian theory. And this is probably, I think, the most contrived of all of them. And I'm like you, I'm not 100% sure why it went down in this way, where there had to be a fake Mandillion, as opposed to simply saying, well, they discovered the cloth and, that was it. They were going to eventually show the Sindon, and they just wanted to have this fake Mandillion hanging around in case people asked about it. But once the Sindon was going to be shown, probably nobody's going to care about the image of the face. They got the whole body now. I really couldn't tell you, but I will say that I mean, I've heard uh, tell rather recently that Ian Wilson is in the process of writing yet a fourth book, and that one of the things that he has said about it is he intends to make changes to what his theory is. Which, if I was one of the people defending what he is saying, I would really wonder about that because I've been defending it for years, and maybe there are things that he needs to um,
Okay.
change around. I personally think, for example, that if he were to adopt uh, my hypothesis in terms of the shroud being in Antioch in the early years, he could do that because I myself, before I got all the information I did from my research, I suggested in a paper back in 1997, I think, that when Antioch was destroyed, maybe the shroud was just taken from Antioch to Edessa, and it would have been there by 540. It'd be 4 years in advance of where Wilson picks up with his Mandylion theory. That's what I actually thought it was for 10 years until I did research and found out the patriarch of Antioch fled Antioch and went to Anatolia, and that he was an appointee of Justinian I. So, yeah, there are things I think that he could tweak and that he should tweak. And, but I don't know what I have no idea what he has in mind.
Yeah. I guess the issue is once you start questioning certain aspects of the Abgar legend, then it opens people up to going, well, what else from the Abgar legend shouldn't we use?
All
Because
right.
again, their primary thing is this Abgar legend written in the 10th century. So once you go,
Yeah, and that's another thing that Wilson does, Dale. If you read his book, I mean, if you know everything you need to know about it, you can follow it. But for people who don't know, and like when I read it the first time, I wasn't paying too much attention to his saying, well, this is from the Abgar legend of the 10th century versus the Abgar legend of the 4th century, or what have you. And most of what this theory is dependent on is on that 10th century legend.
Mhm.
And I mean, without the 10th century legend, you don't have the shroud being hidden in the wall for 500 years. That doesn't show up before that time. And I also think that, you got to live by the sword and die by the sword. And so if you want to depend on the legend and want people to depend on the legend for the proposition that the shroud was hidden in the wall in the 1st century, then you've got to go with what the legend says in terms of how the shroud was discovered in the 6th century. And the legend says that this visionary woman appeared to the bishop of Edessa and showed him where the shroud was. Well, that doesn't go too well with a history when we're into visions and things like that. So Wilson discards that and he makes up this thing that's perfectly logical. It's just that it's not documented anywhere that maybe when they were repairing the walls, they discovered the image at that time. But you wouldn't know it as you're reading through it. You kind of think, well, yeah, they did discover it at that time. But if you're going to live by the legend, to put it in the wall, you got to really kind of live by the legend of how it got out of the wall. Because once you disclaim the second part of it, you're really disclaiming the first part of it too. If I can't believe the second part of it, why should I believe the first part? Why should I believe there was ever a cloth put in the wall? You know?
yeah, yeah, awesome. Next,
Okay, let's see.
next slide, or
Yes, please.
okay.
Okay, so we're going to go all the way to the end of the 12th century, and this is the famous um, illustrations from the Hungarian Prey manuscript.
So we
And
just for the audience, we've gone back in time about a decade or a decade and a half from
yes,
when
yes.
the
And the
1190.
reason we did that, just so they don't get too confused, is I was just following the progression of how often two objects were mentioned in the imperial collection. So I wanted to carry them through and show all the way through to Robert de Clary in 1204. They were still saying there were two separate objects. But yes, now going back about 10 years in the history in which these illustrations appear. And in around 1193, there was a king of Hungary called Bela, and he was King Bela the Third, actually, and he ordered the preparation of a codex, which would have various historical information codes, and that sort of thing. And he decided that he wanted various things illustrated. So he used an artist, probably a Hungarian artist, to do a whole lot of illustrations. Two of them are kind of relevant to the shroud. And in this first one, you can see that it's a shroud like Jesus being laid out, tended to maybe by Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus. And the hands are crossed, just like in all the other portrayals, right hand over the left hand, lying over the pelvic area. Fingers are exceptionally elongated. Thumbs are out of sight. Forehead has some kind of mark on it. Might be the blood stain that some people think is shaped like a 3, but it's definitely shroud-like in terms of its portrayal. The next slide. In the next slide, it's the illustration also in this codex. And so what you have here is arguably, it appears to be, because the angels are showing, or the women are showing up here to do the anointing on Easter Day. They run into the angel on the left and pointing down, the angel is pointing down to what is arguably the Jesus burial shroud, because it has kind of the herringbone weave fashion on it. And it also has over on its, towards the center, a little bit to the right, it has the 4 so-called inverted L pattern poker holes that you see on the shroud. Now, there's a whole lot of back and forth from this. I mean, the skeptics kind of have their day with this. They say you're not looking at a burial cloth here, you're looking at the lid of the tomb. And that this really isn't a herringbone attempt to portray the herringbone weave. And they say, oh, those holes they're a little bit peculiar, but if you look to the right where all those crosses are, there's a couple holes there. So once in a while, holes show up. Yeah, just go over down to like the right where the red crosses, you can see holes in there and things like that. So they have their usual mishmash of if you take individual things, you can kind of set them up like ducks and then knock them down. But the bottom line is that, again, you have to consider this in a broad context, a broader context, because the previous illustration shows Jesus and his body being anointed, and it is in shroud-like pose. And now you have something that looks kind of sort of like it has characteristics of his burial cloth. And so, it's just another indication of knowledge of what the burial cloth looked like, and also what the image looked like. Now, how in the world can this illustrator in Hungary be coming up with this stuff? What's he got to do with the burial cloth of Jesus in Constantinople? Well, and I was the first one to bring this out many years ago, and you see people talking about it now, but they kind of forget how and when it came out, which I think I did this in around 2008. I actually did the biography of Bela, King Bela III. And about 30 years before this, in the 1160s, he was a prince of Hungary. He had an older brother, Stephen, so he was going to be king. And so the grand plan was that Manuel, who was the emperor of Byzantium at that time, he was a little bit on years, and so was his wife, and they didn't have an heir. They had a daughter, but she's not an heir to the throne. And so they make a deal with King Stephen. He sends his little brother, Prince Bela, over to Constantinople, and he becomes engaged to marry the daughter of Emperor Manuel, and he is thereupon appointed emperor designate. So when Manuel dies, he's going to be the new emperor. He is the appointed heir. And in that position, as the appointed heir, it's very likely that Manuel showed him what was in the imperial relic collection, including the shroud. And So it kind of fits with even the imperial covenant because he's not an emperor, but he's a designated emperor. And so I believe that he viewed the shroud, and this is 30 years later. So, they didn't, you couldn't take Polaroids or, snapshots back in those days. This is strictly from his memory. And I think this is how he remembers the image. And this is kind of how he remembers the cloth. And he's probably just telling the artist, okay, draw this cloth here with some zigzag lines. Oh, I remember it had four holes in it, so it was kind of like an inverted L. And so I think when you take this all in context, it's pretty strong evidence, given the timing and everything that's happened before and everything that's going to happen after. It's pretty strong evidence for the fact that this too is a representation of the Shroud of Turin and the image on the Shroud of Turin. And this is in 1193, which is a full 67 years before the carbon dating says the shroud even exists. But it's debatable. I've seen the debate. I think it can go back and forth. But I think this is evidence that in a broad context it's not as important as some people make it. I don't believe it. And it's not as inconsequential as the skeptics would make it. But I think it's good and valid evidence. And it's like any case you have, it's a series of evidences that you're putting forward. And when you consider this in context, it fits what happened before, it fits what happened afterwards, and it seems to be portraying the shroud. And if it is portraying the shroud, then this alone knocks out the validity of the carbon dating.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask because this is something I've gone back and forth on, and I think even at the moment I'm kind of, believe it or not, I'm kind of leaning towards a very weak skepticism
Mhm.
on this evidence. But again, there are like those L-shaped holes. There are at least a couple powerful arguments on the pro-shroud side. But I just wanted to get your opinion from a historical perspective, looking at other images. That by far the most powerful skeptical thing is Hugh Ferry's this kind of background knowledge argument, right? Based on other depictions from the time before, during, and after this time in the 1190s of this anointing scene,
Mhm.
which clearly depicts Jesus' tomb and his lid and the three Marys and the angel, and then the burial shroud sort of crumpled up or laying over the lid of the tomb.
Mhm.
Um, and there is this depiction where it's unambiguously it is the tomb that's being depicted, not it's not the shroud kind of thing. What's your take as a historian on these other images and their relationship? Like, would at least in terms of the prior probabilities, wouldn't you say there's a strong case to say, yeah, this image is just a very crudely drawn version of those other paintings, or why should we?
Right, 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 right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the logic of that argument. Hugh is usually logical. Um, but here's where I think that as a skeptic, he's too close-minded about it. Um, in the broad picture, this is not art that was done for the sake of art, which probably all those other three Marys portrayals were.
Mhm.
I mean, in the other portrayals, it was probably somebody writing a book on the scripture or the Gospels or some sermon, some lesson from it. And if they got an illustrator, they said to the illustrator, read the scripture and come up with something that seems to represent it. This is kind of like what we talked about with the Byzantine art from earlier in the 11th century. This is done under the direction of a ruler. And just like the Byzantine art of that time was done for the direction of the emperor, this is being done at the direction of a king, uh, a Hungarian king, Bela III. And so, I'm sure that the illustrator must be familiar with the Three Marys text and maybe has even seen other renderings of scenes such as this. But this was done by Bela. Bela is the one who ordered the codex. Bela is the one that would have had to approve the illustrations. And Bela was one of the few people on earth outside of Constantinople who, in all likelihood, as former emperor designate, had seen the Sindon relic, the Shroud of Turin. And he's the one directing this artist to make both of these illustrations. And in the first one, which that doesn't come from any, Three Marys rendering. Jesus is being tended to by Joseph of Arimathea. It's a completely different scene, but the Jesus in that scene is a shroud like Jesus with his hands crossed. And in this one, which is a typical, Three Marys type scene, all of a sudden you have an object, and you have, I mean, this to me, I don't know if I was looking at this as a piece of supposed to be accurate art. I don't think I would draw the shroud quite like this. It looks like it's a little bit rigid. Its position is not where I would necessarily want to see it. But it has no doubt these squiggly lines on it, which, why, if it's a tomb lid, does it have these squiggly lines on it? Why, if it's a tomb lid, does it have three holes in an inverted L pattern? But if Bella is saying, Jesus is gone by this time, he's risen, so he's not even in this picture, but he was laying on, what I saw, he was lying on a cloth, and it had these like rigid herringbone twill type things, and it had four holes, and this is the way they were laid out. Just do something like that. I could see an artist with the obvious, not great skill that this artist has in this case, drawing a burial cloth, or at least a symbol of a burial cloth, looking like this. And so, I mean, I'm open to either explanation or logic, but I think what Hugh does, and even the way that you put the question, it's too much on the technical side. It's too much on, say, the artistic side, or previously the scientific side. I'm dealing with the history of this, and if this did not involve a codex being ordered by King Bela III, who used to be the emperor designate of the Byzantine Empire, who was engaged to the daughter of the then reigning emperor, if it wasn't him that was involved in this codex, I'd probably agree with Hugh Farron. I might say from a technically standard artistic standpoint, I don't know that I can really argue with a lot of force that this is a depiction of the burial cloth, the Shroud of Turin. But if you tell me what I've just related about Bela III, who he was, where he was, what he likely saw, I combine it with the earlier illustration that shows Jesus with his arms crossed like that, I could very well say throw in the history, and I think this could very well be a depiction of the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because yeah, like you said, I've kind of solely based my opinions on the artistic
Yeah,
arguments, right? So like, the L-shaped holes or the weave. I
yeah,
Bob Rucker's shown us a close-up where it would look exactly like this, close up to the naked eye, the weave of a herringbone cloth and stuff like that. So I think those are powerful arguments, and the skeptics, Hugh doesn't really have a good response for things like that. But
mhm,
same with the background evidence of the other paintings. But you brought in this whole other dimension that I've never even considered as being a part of the case based on the historical background.
right, right,
And yeah, I don't know. That's something that's new to me, so I'm gonna need to like consider that. What role
right.
does that
You know
play?
what it's
That
like? You know what it's like, Dale? It's like if you go back to the Hymn of the Pearl. If you want to have an argument with Hugh Farry over the Hymn of the Pearl, and you're just going to deal with the structure and what are the words that are said there, you know, you could bat it back and forth, you know, and you would say, I'm not sure that we don't come out on a stalemate on this. I mean, depending on how you look at it. But I look at the history. I say that, just like I say that this codex was directed by King Bela III, who was in Constantinople, we know, most scholars believe, that the Hymn of the Pearl was written by Barsanes, who was a close personal childhood friend of King Abgar the Great, who it is believed converted to Christianity about 20 years before this poem was written. And in all likelihood, if that happened through a baptism, his best friend of his life, Barcenas, was there. And if in fact the shroud was a part of that was used to convince him, which you find in the Abgar legend, that there was an image that was used to help convince a king to convert. If you believe other historical texts in which Bishop Abercius, who wrote the inscription of Abercius, is talking about traveling to Syria with a large fish, of a great size, covered with blood and water. If you just put together all the other historical factors, now you're saying, wait a minute, this is not just a poem. It's not a poem written by anybody. Hugh Farry wants to treat this as if it's a poem written by anybody at any time. No, this is written by Abgar the Great's best friend about 20 years after Abgar converted. And the offensive position is he converted because he was shown the Shroud of Turin. So now, when I look at that poem and I'm hearing about a mirror image, and that it has the image of the King of Kings, and Jesus was called the King of Kings in the book of Revelation. That's how he's known at that time. We don't use the phrase as much today. And it's this author who's writing this text. When you take into account the historical implications of this, it's enough to tip it the other way. At least it is for me.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, just one last follow-up on this. What would you say then? So, given this historical evidence, I get you're saying it tips the scales.
Mhm.
But I'm just saying, like, let's say all of this is true. What makes it improbable, on a balance of probabilities that this is just that, okay, it is the friend of the king and all that context and stuff like that, but they're just depicting an anointing scene like the other ones. Like, why would that be improbable,
Well,
even
see,
given
if,
all the
if, if
background?
you asked me, if you were Hugh and you put that question to me, I'd say, show me the other scenes that you're talking about, so I can judge them. Why is this? Do the
Okay.
other scenes kind of show me some contrast between the scenes, or do they show some agreement with the scenes? I mean, I think if you showed me another three Marys in which it had an object that had four holes in it, inverted pattern, and some kind of crazy uh, lines through it, and it was clear in that picture it was a tomb lid, then I'd say you're absolutely right. I mean, this is nothing new or whatever. But just show me where anything like this is shown up in the Three Marys presentations. If you can't show me that, then this is unique. And then you have to ask yourself, why is it unique,
Hmm.
to this particular state? If you showed me a poem like the Hymn of the Pearl, and you showed me that it was written in the first century, or it was written, in Spain or somewhere other than next to Edessa, right after the conversion of a king, then I have to take that text in historical context as well. I have to take this illustration in historical context as well. And in this illustration, nobody is refuting that this was done at the direction of King Bela III, and nobody is disputing that he was a former emperor designate of Byzantium who lived in Constantinople while the shroud was there, while it could be seen by emperors. So
Yep.
it means something. And then it's just a matter of how much weight that you give it. If I had to, walk away, if somebody said to me, to what level of surety do you think that the Hungarian Cray manuscript illustrations are evidence of the shroud's existence at this time? I'd say because of the counter arguments on the art kind of thing, I'd say that I'd have like a 70% certainty
Hmm.
And on other things like, the hymn of the pearl, or, the Latin sermon, or, any of the other evidence, I have, feelings that each one of those evidences could be as much as, 90%. I mean, I never go over 90% because I think 10% is out there on almost anything you see. But it's a pretty high level of probability, and this one is maybe not as strong as some of the others.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for answering that. Like I said, a fascinating new angle that I personally have never considered. So I'm gonna have to do a reassessment and factor that in and see
Yeah,
if maybe I'm shifted back to the Pro-Shroud side because yeah,
right. And I think, Hugh is not a historian. He doesn't come from a historian's background. I mean, he understands the history, he can read it and understand it. But I don't think as he approaches it, he approaches any of these things primarily from the standpoint of a historian. I think he approaches it as a scientist, and so
yeah,
he's going to look at this thing kind of scientifically, or maybe as an artist would, or that sort of thing. But you can't forget the history. And I've said many times, not many people agree with me, but I think that the historical proof for the authenticity of the shroud is far greater than the scientific proof. And to me, the greatest scientific proof is a negative proof. It's that proof of, so how did you make that image anyway back in the 14th century? That's like a negative scientific proof. But what is the scientific proof that we have proving the authenticity of the shroud? A lot of these things, coins on the eyes, pollen from the Holy Land, even this new thing, the wax thing that you're talking about. I mean, how strong are any of these scientific arguments? I'm just not, maybe it's because I'm not a scientist, but I'm just not really impressed by a whole lot of the science that's gone into it. Even Rucker's thing, which I think is highly inventive, and he sounds like, he's got it figured out as a matter of nuclear considerations. It's purely theoretical. It hasn't been proved, and I guess the only way he's going to prove it is if they do a few more experiments on the shroud itself, and they find out that they get carbon dates that go up to the year 8000 or something like that. But I just, when I look at this stuff, it amazes me how many people are tied up strictly in the science. It's like you said about Fonte. He's so strictly tied up into the science that when it comes to, this wax thing, now he's got to get involved in the history, but he's not going to get involved in the history. He's not going to read all this stuff. He's going to go to the cliff notes and then try to find out what he can about. And so if you come at this and you don't have the history in mind too, at least as a complementary part, if not as I do, a primary part, then you're not going to appreciate really the significance of the historical significance of a lot of what you have here.
yep, I 100% agree. I think that's a valid point. Is you need the totality of the evidence,
Exactly.
and there is this interconnected web between scientific conclusions and historical conclusions, and
Right.
sometimes historical evidence can have a bearing on our scientific conclusions and vice versa.
Well, look at the infamous carbon dating. There, if that's right, then you might as well throw out all of my writings for the past 40 years. I mean, you know,
Yeah,
whatever I saw and whatever I argued for just couldn't be right if the carbon date is correct. There wasn't a shroud until at least 1260. So yeah, the science can affect the history, but this is where also the history affects the science. So, on the same issue, if the carbon date is being used as the argument, scientific argument for the inauthenticity of the shroud, then what's the history of that cloth? They did an artificial cloth as early as 1260, and through everything I've read that Hugh Farry's put out, he thinks that it's more likely in the 1260, 1280 range than anywhere else. Just based on what the scientific data show. So there had to be a history for that shroud from let's say from 1270 till 1355. And it's 85 years. What is that history? How in the world is there an object like this, as awesome as this, and nobody knows about it? And he's coming up with this medieval hypothesis, quem quiritus, and all that, but it's not documented by anything that, I mean, other than the fact that they had these ceremonies and they used to use a shroud, but not one shroud ever has an image on it or is described as 14 foot long or anything like that. So he's got a problem with history disputing his scientific theory, you see? So they can contradict one another, and maybe one can disprove the other. But I don't see at least this uh, carbon dating test of 1988 ever being accepted to the point where it conclusively throws out authenticity of the shroud or the history of the shroud. And I don't see the failure of the medievalists to come up with a history from the time they said that this existed as necessarily throwing out their theory that it's medieval. But it's pretty strong evidence. It's what we would call in law prima facie evidence. It's enough evidence that puts the burden on the other side to come forward and to come up with more persuasive proof than that.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Well said. So, all right, I'll let you, we can move on from this because
All
I
right.
totally agree with what you said, but
All right. Let's go to
13th century is what's popping up on my end.
yeah. And before I get to the 13th century, I just want to quickly, because it could take a long time, to just spell out what happened in the crazy world of the Byzantine rulers. Remember, when this is going on, um, when Bela is in Constantinople, the emperor is Manuel Comnenus. He's from the Comnenus family. And what happened with Bela, I don't think I mentioned this, is that Manuel's wife conceived the child in 1168 and gave birth to that child in 1169. And they named him Alexia. So now he had an heir. So he didn't need Bella anymore. So they called off that engagement. And Bella actually turned around and married the sister of Manuel's wife. So they kept it kind of in the family there. And then in like about 1170, if I recall, Manuel dies. And so he has only this heir, Alexios, and he's only like 3 years old or 2 years old or what have you. And so they try to rule through him, but through his mother serving as a regent. And there's a nephew called Adronicus, and he quickly has Alexios killed, and he seizes the throne. So you still have a Komnenos on the throne, but he's a rather nasty guy who's killed the actual heir. And so there's a lot of discontent in Constantinople. And a new family comes forward that's related to all these people. It's called the Angelos family, you know, and they are anything other than angels, these people. And in 1185, they start a coup, and it's suppressed by Adronicus. And Adronicus exiles this fellow Alexios Angelos, and he sentences his older brother, Isaac Angelos, to death. But, this is why they say things are Byzantine. Isaac appeals to the citizens of Constantinople. They riot and they storm the palace and they get Adronicus and they hang him. And they proclaim Isaac emperor. And Isaac brings his brother Alexis back from exile, and he makes him a member of his court. And this is the way Alexios repays him in 1195, about 7 years later, while his brother is out of town, Isaac. He gets the army, he seizes the throne, and when Isaac gets back, he not only imprisons him, he blinds him. And then for the next 5 years, he depletes the imperial treasury to the point where Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI is demanding tribute. and this guy figures that he's going to have to pay it. So he starts trying to get gold and silver from all over the place, and he starts raiding the tombs of his predecessor emperors to steal gold and silver from their tombs. So that's kind of the fellow that we're up against. He's not Mr. Nice Guy. And so we move to the 13th century, and then this is where I had said before that this Alexios, this mean and nasty Alexios, he's the first emperor who says, I don't have to go along with the imperial covenant. And he turns the relic, the shroud, over to Nicholas Massaridis, most likely so he can take its gold case and use that money too. But now this is the next slide. So this is the slide I was referencing before. In 1201, Massaridis pronounces the Pharaoh's chapel holds the burial clothes sindons of Christ. And he declares that in this place, he, that's Christ, arises again. And the sudarium and the burial sindons are the proof. Sindons, they mean linens at this point. They are of linen, cheap material, readily accessible, still smelling of perfume, exempt from corruption, since they wrap the indescribable naked corpse sprinkled with myrrh after the passion. So he knows, because he's seen the shroud now, that the image that Jesus was naked when he was crucified. How does he know that the corpse of Jesus is naked if he hasn't seen the image on the shroud of Turin? So this is further confirmation that the Sindon, which is now in the Pharaoh's chapel under the care of Nicholas Massaridis, this is where that that particular relic is in 1201, and of course the Mandilion is still hanging from the chains in the Pharaoh's chapel. Okay, what happens after this is that, just to kind of sum this up, the son of the imprisoned Isaac, his name happens to be Alexios too, also not two. He escapes. He hooks up with the Fourth Crusade. This is where he makes the promise with the Fourth Crusade, restore my father to the throne and we'll finance your crusade. And the Fourth Crusade then goes in 1203 to Constantinople. They throw out the reigning emperor, who's not even the bad Alexios. He got usurped by another guy who happens to be named Alexios. And anyway, they throw him out and they put the son of Isaac on the throne with Isaac. They kind of co-rule. And then the Crusaders are saying, pay us, pay us, pay us. And when the usurper comes in, he says, I'm not going to pay that debt that Alexius made with you. And then that's when the crusade besieges Constantinople and gets across the wall in Blachernay. And it's during this period of time that Robert de Clary says that the Lord Sindon was stood up straight every Friday so that the figure of the Lord could be plainly seen on it in the Church of St. Mary in Blachernay. You can go to the next slide, please. You with me, Dale?
Yep.
Okay.
It was frozen.
Yeah, gotcha. Right. Okay. And so that's what I talked about. Go to the next slide, please.
Exhibition. That's it from its end of slideshow after the
Oh,
exhibition.
that's the last slide you've got?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't think we need them for the rest of the thing. Then I'll just go from the slides that I have here.
All right. And if you want, send me the
Yeah, I'll send it to you again. There were a few after this. So
sure. There we go.
Okay, so the exhibitions that, and I think you mentioned this before, where they may have involved this a contraption of some kind, which John Jackson imagined. But if they did use the shroud, when it's saying it was stood up, that could have been as simple as they had some kind of vertical thing and they put the shroud up, looked at it that way. But I think Jackson imagines that the Byzantines who used contraptions may have actually shown Jesus that could have pulled the cloth up from below as if Jesus was was resurrecting at that time. And I would just mention that if that's what they were doing, again, that could have been an enactment of Jesus' resurrection, or it could have been a reenactment of the extraction of the shroud from the well in Camiliana, because we have those artworks, those icons that show the Jesus arising from the well. It could have just as easily been that if they were doing that, but even that's not settled. That's a hypothesis on Jackson's part. Okay, let's see. Oops. Now, so what happens is that the crusade breaches the walls and they create havoc in Constantinople for 3 days. They go on, and everything they can get into, they're just uh, breaking it down, stealing what was in it. There's a lot of relics that are stolen. They go back to Western Europe when the Crusaders go back. They give a lot of these relics and treasures to the bishops that are connected, and they bring them back to their churches. And this is where, in the Mandylion theory, uh, Ian Wilson quotes Robert de Clary as saying that when the sack was over and Constantinople was conquered, no one, either Greek or French, ever knew what became of the Synod. And when he says that, this is where the story often ends before you go into the missing years. And it's like, okay, so somebody stole the shroud. Who did that and where did it go? And of course, Wilson's answer, another part of his hypothesis, is it eventually went to the Knights Templar. But, that's not really where the story should have ended, because you should be talking about what happened in Constantinople immediately after that. Robert de Clary himself describes himself as a poor knight of the host. And he admits that his inquiries, when he asked questions, they never reached above the host, the army itself, and townsfolk. So he is not somebody that was in touch with the leaders of the Crusades and the nobles of the Crusades. He never took part in any of their secret councils. And so the idea of creating the impression that the shroud definitely disappeared in the sack of Constantinople, it can be misleading if there's a history that follows, and there is a history that follows. But when I first read Wilson's book, it seemed, extremely logical to me, and I thought to myself, well, after I read his version of the hypothesis where it involved the Knights Templar, I thought I came up with a better explanation with the Cathars of southern France who had allies in Constantinople at that time. But I was still trying to go along with the idea that the shroud disappeared from Constantinople. But I later found out, when I did other research, that that wasn't the end of the story, because while the army itself was sacking the city of Constantinople, the leaders of the crusade were taking control of the palaces, of the castles that were there. And so that the Bucolian Palace, the main palace where the Pharaoh's chapel was, that was um, uh, taken over, armed and garrisoned and protected against the other troops. And that is actually recorded in a book written by Geoffroy de Villard-Thouin, who was a crusade leader. He's not mentioned, and his book is not mentioned by Wilson. And he wrote that the Marquis de Montferrat immediately took control of the Bucolian Palace, and even over in Blachernay, where there was a Blachernay Palace, Henry of Flanders took that over, and both of them set guards over their treasuries. Now, although the shroud was exhibited in Blachernay at the church, it was known for a while that the Crusaders were coming in to take over the city or try to take over the city because this usurper told the crusade that he would not be paying his debt in February. And the raid did not come until April. So you had a period of 2 months there. And everyone knew that the weakest part of the city to defend was in Blachernay, which is where this church was. So they surely took the shroud out of the church where it would not be protected and put it in one of the palaces. Most likely the safer place would be in the Bucolian Palace, out of where the war zone would be. And so that's where the shroud went, and that's where the mandilion had always remained. It was never taken out of the Pharaoh's chapel. So we have Geoffrey's text, not mentioned by Wilson. And now there's another text. It's written in 1206, 2 years after the sack, by Nicholas of Otranto. He was appointed after the sack of Constantinople by the Pope to be the papal legate to Constantinople, which at that time then was being run by the Latin emperors, by the conquerors. And he filed what they call a disputation report. And in that report, he recited that when the city was captured, French knights found in the treasury of the Bucolian Palace Jesus' burial shrouds. And that after the sack, he himself, this Nicholas of Otranto, in an inspection, saw these burial linens in that treasury. So it shows that the burial linens, it doesn't say the shroud or the sindon, but it says Jesus' burial linens, of which, of course, the sindon was one, was safely still in the treasury of the Latin emperors, at least as of 1206. And then in the following year, Nicholas Mazzarides, who, as you'll recall, he was the Byzantine relic supervisor. When the Latins took Constantinople, they fired him, and he left Constantinople, and they put a Latin in his place. And 3 years later, his brother died. He had his brother named John, and he had to go to Constantinople and deliver a eulogy for his brother. And during the course of the eulogy, he said, the Athania, that is the linens, and the sudariums, that is the shroud-like linens, of Jesus still remained in the city. So we don't know where he got that information, although, it would be logical that he went back and that he went to the treasury, and he was given some kind of courtesy by his successor to go in. And it would seem like this is some personal knowledge of his, but it could be something he was told. But it puts the burial shrouds of Jesus, just like Nicholas Otranto, in the treasury of the Bucolian Palace. So that means that the shroud did not disappear out of Constantinople or was stolen. It's just that Robert de Clary didn't know where it went. But surely the nobles and the leaders of the Crusades, and particularly by this time there's a new Latin king, Baldwin I, he knows where these relics are, except that the French at that time did not put much value in the relics. And, in the next 30, 40 years, they were being attacked by each other and by outside forces. And the last thing that they were thinking about was the relics that they had in their collection. And nobody gave them any thought until the last emperor of the Latin emperor, Baldwin II, became the emperor in approximately 1228, and then he started turning his attention to the relics, but that's another story for another day. Um,
I have a question if it's
sure, go ahead.
so I'm just kind of curious. Same deal as so we know that Ian Wilson with the image of Edessa theory had to come up with that massive ad hoc element to explain why the later documents had two separate objects, right?
Right.
I'm kind of curious, how does because Ian Wilson, according to the Knights Templar theory and that sort of thing, the shroud is gone as a 1203. It's 1204. It's disappeared and it's gone. So, what does he do to try and explain the 1206 and the 1207 text? Does he ever address them at
I don't
all?
think he ever addresses it. I know he didn't address it in his 1978 book, in which he put forward his theory, but I don't think he ever gets to that, um, even in his subsequent books. What he does at that point, he says, okay, the Mandylion used to be the shroud. It's not the shroud. The shroud is then becomes known as the Sindon. There's a fake Mandylion there also, and the shroud was exhibited in Blachernay, and so the Latins came in, and somebody among the Latins, one of their leaders, stole the shroud from the church, as if the Byzantines would have just put this in an unguarded church, but they stole it. And I always thought that he was saying that among the uh, Crusaders, there were Knights Templar, so they took it. But if you read his book carefully, I think he knows that there were no Knights Templar involved in the sack of Constantinople. They didn't participate in the Fourth Crusade. And so when I read it more carefully, he's saying that whoever the thief is, whoever the thief was that took the shroud, he then got in touch with the Templars who were known to have money and collect relics and sold the shroud to the Templars, and then they had it for approximately the next 110 years or thereabouts until the Templars were persecuted in France. And then that's when it went to the family of Geoffrey de Charnay. That's his version of it. And I don't think he's ever changed that version. I think he has expressed a lot of doubts about the whole Templar theory. He actually went to a conference in 2012 in Spain and basically disclaimed the whole Templar theory and suggested the shroud had been taken from Constantinople to, I think, some place like Bulgaria. I might not have the country straight, and that there's a whole rigmarole with that, that Geoffrey de Charnay passed through that country many years later, and this is where he got the shroud. But I haven't seen him pushing that, and what I have seen him do is sort of kind of double down on the Templar
Well,
theory that he's had.
okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of interested then. So not just Ian Wilson, but anyone who takes that similar theory that the shroud disappeared, whoever or however it disappeared in 1204 with the sacking of the city, but yet we have these texts from 2 to 3 years after the fact mentioning this Sindon. So
Yeah,
the shroud's gone, the Mandylion's gone. What do they do with this Sindon that's still there? They have to explain it.
they never do. This is what they do. I've written about this. In my book of 2021, I got all this. And if you're too lazy to read the book, you can go back and you can look at the chronology that I have. I have all these texts cited. If it's inconvenient, they don't talk about it. you know, and quite honestly, there are supporters of the Mandylion theory who do not accept the Templar part of it. I think early in our programs, I said Wilson's theory is kind of like an Oreo cookie. It's got three parts, and the first part is the first 5 centuries or thereabouts. Second part runs from about 500 to where we're talking about now, about 1204. The third part is the Templar part. And even a big supporter of his, Dan Scavone, who was very active with the Shroud, who was a academic historian, he never bought on to the Templar theory because scholars, experts on the Templars have come right out and said the Templars never had the Shroud. It's that simple. And things that Wilson was relying on, like testimony given by people during the persecution of the Templars. Scavone even noticed that these people were under torture. You can't go by what they're saying. They're saying what their persecutors want them to say, and all that. So you kind of got to look at. I mean, we've talked about the Mandylion theory. When I first read it, I never accepted parts 1 or part 3. I never accepted the inside or outside of the Oreo. The first paper I wrote went against the Templar theory. I thought the Shroud would have gone with the Cathars in southern France. Then the next paper I wrote was on Antioch that said the Shroud didn't go to Edessa. It went to Antioch. But for years, I believed the central part of it, that eventually the Shroud in the 6th century made its way to Edessa, and everything that Wilson said about the history from that point to 1204 was correct. But that's when I did not know that there was this other Akira Coates cloth that was actually in Constantinople before, in all likelihood, before whatever they had in Edessa called the image of Edessa became the image of Edessa. So, no, that's why I think it's perfectly okay. There are people that you say, well, then what happened with the Shroud thereafter? And you show them these texts which say, well, whatever happened to it, it had to happen after 1207, and it had to involve the Latin emperors who were the owners of the cloth after that time. And they'll shrug their shoulders like they do for most other things, but I don't think that they care that much about whether the Shroud went with the Templars or somewhere else. The central part of their argument is the Shroud was this image of Edessa Mandylion icon that you can trace from the years approximately 544 to 1204. That's what they go on, and so I don't think that Wilson ever turns his attention to anything that disputes his theory. So if you look at his original theory, I mean, I think that given his research, he must know about, for example, the Hymn of the Pearl. Why does he never talk about the Hymn of the Pearl? Because if the Hymn of the Pearl is the Shroud, and it's noticed in the early 2nd century, how can it be noticed in the early 2nd century if his theory has it in a wall in Edessa? So he doesn't talk about Galatians 3:1. He doesn't talk about the Sermon of Athanasius. He doesn't talk about the Hymn of the Pearl. And I think this is what happens here. If he's got a hidden, a missing years theory, and if these texts contradict that theory, they're just not dealt with. They go right past them, and you move on from there. So, but they exist, and I mean, I'm not the first person that has ever seen these texts. And I mean, Dorothy Crispino saw some of these texts years ago, and then she had her own theory for what happened with the Shroud, which I don't think is very plausible, but she had her own theory that the Shroud did not leave Constantinople till about 1261, and it was taken by the last emperor, Baldwin II, who then gave it as a gift to some of the people who had been supporting them. And guess who some of these people were? They were the ancestors of Geoffrey de Charnay's first wife. And so her idea was that that's how the Shroud got from Constantinople down to Geoffrey de Charnay. And there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't happen, not the least of which is that Baldwin II was a rapacious emperor and would have never given anything of value away. But I mean, at least she was on the right track. that the shroud was still in Constantinople for a period of years after 1204.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to ask that because it is interesting that yeah, a lot of people, including yourself, say yeah, it postdates 1207, and obviously we'll cover that period in the next episode and that sort of
Right.
thing. But I just wanted to ask for the people that say it was gone as of 1204, whatever, doesn't matter, Knights Templar or any other theory, Cathars or whatever, there is that issue where it's, well, you're either you have to be a skeptic, like a shroud skeptic, and say, well, there are multiple burial shrouds that they had. One of them, the Shroud of Turin, was gone, while the other one stayed there and was mentioned. And there was no confusion or saying, well, we lost one, but we still have this one. None of that's mentioned. Or I guess you'd have to come up with some kind of replacement, like, oh, they lost the shroud, so they quickly tried to trick people and say, well, see, we still have this shroud or something like that, and pretend like they
Yeah, I mean,
lost.
every one of them obviously is an invention because there's just no, text or anything else that would support that. And again, if you go to Occam's razor, I mean, again, the simplest solution is that the Crusaders came in, and per the text, the castles were guarded, and therefore the relics ended up in the castles, and the castles then became the property of the new Latin emperor. So there's the path for whatever happened to the shroud happened involving the Latin emperor after that. Anything other than that is just not following the text or the evidence. You're just saying, oh, there could have been several shrouds, somebody could have done something with something, or what have you. And again, and I know that you know this, but when I get to the missing years, I take the shroud from Baldwin, who's the owner, Baldwin II, who's the owner of the shroud, who is selling countless, that's an exaggeration. He's selling 21 former Byzantine relics to his cousin, King Louis the Ninth in France. And so that's where you would think the shroud would go, same place that these other relics would go. And you find out that Louis' confidant is the grandfather of Geoffrey de Charnay. So if the shroud ends up going to Louis and to Louis' confidant, Jean de Joinville, then you can easily trace it from him through the family, through Geoffrey's mother, to Geoffrey de Charnay. You've got kind of the easiest, most logical path that you could get to for the shroud.
Absolutely. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I guess that's our next episode then. We'll cover what 1208 up till
Right, 1208 till we'll go to somewhere where Charney um, exhibits the shroud, maybe up to 1355. And just kind of as an asterisk PS, because this can be lost in this, what happened to the phony Mandillion, right? If you follow the Mandillion theory, there's a Mandillion, but it's phony. You don't follow the Mandillion theory, then there's a real Mandillion. And, it's the cloth that they came to Edessa in 944. Anyway, what happens to that cloth? The last time we hear about it is when Robert de Clary says it's in its golden case and it's being hung from the ceiling of the Pharaoh's chapel. Well, the scholars, the real scholars, the academic scholars who look at this, they say that the Mandillion was probably not even recognized to be an image of Jesus, that however it was stored at that time, they folded the small cloth, the towel, inside out, and it looked like a towel. That's all it looked like. It looked like a small, plain towel. And if you look at the items that Baldwin II sold to his cousin Louis IX in around 1241, listed on that inventory is a holy towel. And the claim of the scholars is that that was the Mandillion. It may have even been kept in the Mandillion reliquary, which that for sure, the reliquary that it had been kept in, that for sure gets to the Sainte Chapelle in Paris. Um, the question is whether the cloth itself did. That's a little bit more debatable. And that eventually it stayed there the entire, I guess, the next several hundred years. And in the course of the French Revolution, when the French revolutionaries were destroying so many religious things, they uh, got to the what was the Mandilion, and they destroyed it in around 1794, and that's the end of the Mandilion story. For the few who believe that the Mandilion was the shroud, but continued to be the shroud was hidden as the Mandilion, that there are people who would take that cloth and say, yes, it got to the Saint Chapelle, but in 1350 or so, King Philip VI gave it to his bravest knight, Geoffrey de Charnay, and that's how it got to de Charnay. But in any event, if you want to go with what the texts say, whatever used to be the Mandilion, real Mandilion, phony Mandilion, it seems to have stayed in Constantinople
Mhm.
until about 1241, and then went to Paris, France, to Louis IX on a sale, essentially a sale of the relics from Baldwin to Louis, and then ended up being destroyed. And that's the end of that story.
I'm just gonna, yeah, let me ask this because, so this is something I have kind of ignored on my end, so I don't really know that much about it. But
Mhm.
is there any connection to the like the Mandilion and the Veil of Veronica? I've just kind of assumed it's just confusion. It's the same thing, but it's through confusion they've gotten these different names and different traditions or something. But in your view, is there any connection between the face cloth, the Mandilion, and the Veil of Veronica, or are they just separate
Well,
objects?
I think that if a connection can be an inspiration, maybe there is. But the Mandilion has this history that we've gone over, and it's totally in the East, even up till the time we talked about today. I mean, you're in either Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, or Constantinople. You're in the East.
Mhm.
Uh, and so that's a tradition of a face of Jesus that is formed in some way, and it kind of moved around, and we know that it existed up until about 1204. The Veronica, though, and I'm not an expert on that. I haven't read about it, but my recollection is that the cloth itself didn't really kind of exist or was referred to until something like the 8th, ninth, or 10th century.
Mhm.
And from the beginning, it was never a story about um, Jesus himself um, using a cloth in any way to get this image on it. It was the mythical Saint Veronica who applied it to Jesus' face as he was walking to Calvary, and applied this cloth to his face. It was a facial image, and then somehow, and I don't even know whether they ever tried to justify it, how that image got from uh, Israel, Judea, to Italy, which is the first place that I think it showed up, and it just started then to be talked about and exhibited. Um, and not with a lot of clarity either. The references are, there was a particular jubilee, and it was shown during this jubilee, but exactly what it looked like, other than be called a face of Christ, nobody really knows. And then at some point in time, it was rumored to have disappeared from Rome, or maybe was lost. Um, I only know that a syndenologist from 20 years ago or more, Isabel Pixit, who spent part of her youth living at the
Mhm.
Vatican in, say, the early 1950s, she claimed that she was shown the Veronica in St. Peter's, and that you couldn't make it out. It was like it had either faded away or it had all discolored into like a black blob. So no, I don't think that there's really a relationship in either the tradition of the cloth,
Mhm.
because the Mandillion is always in the tradition of the King Abgar and that legend, and Veronica is always from the other legend, which came up about the time I think that they were inventing the Stations of the Cross. And Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. It became a station, but I don't think there was very much to it. I think the roots of the Veronica legend have to do with the story of the woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garment and was healed. And in the early days, I forget the name of that woman, but there were statues of her even in some of the churches. And I think that story then evolved into a woman who approached Jesus while he was on his way to Calvary and wiped his face with this cloth. But no, I don't think that they're really related in any real sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah, that was good to ask because I've had some Roman Catholics and stuff like that ask me, and that I haven't really looked into the Bail of Iran. I've just kind of dismissed it on my end. So yeah, it was good
Yeah.
to your.
And isn't it strange? Because the church has possession of it, right? This is the church again. It's got possession of it. It doesn't talk about it. It's like for years, the church didn't talk about the third secret of Fatima. It wasn't convenient, so they didn't talk about it. When the church does not want to talk about the shroud, it doesn't talk about it. So you don't really get. I don't know if the idea is to engender this feeling of mystery or focus on the power of the church over these particular objects and that sort of thing. But I think it's why secular scholars try to get their information out of books and texts and regular histories, because I think when you get into the ecclesiastical works, which we spend a lot of time doing because they're the only place where the shroud could be mentioned, you really have to wonder who's running the show, what their motives are at any given time, and therefore, just exactly how true it is. And I don't blame the church entirely, because in the early days of the shroud, they were fighting for survival. They were under persecution, and they did adopt this discipline of the secret in which they had to talk in code. And they did that, and it's shown on archaeological objects and things like that. But it's very hard sometimes to get the truth out where the church is concerned, and where I think most other institutions, if it was a museum, they would say, "Oh, we've been holding on to this veil of Veronica now, and for the past 200 years, you can't see anything from it." I don't know how miraculous it was at any time, but it's not very miraculous now. Instead, they put in a pillar in St. Peter's and they say the veil of Veronica is in there. And they've got everybody believing that, yeah, maybe it could still be there. It goes back to these times. But I kind of believed Isabel Pixik. I didn't think she made up the story. I know she was very close to the Roman clergy at that time. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that. As I said, Jack will send me the updated slides that has everything. So for the last bit, that'll be on my blog, and you can follow along that way as Jack goes over that bit. But yeah, other than that, I just want to say thank you so much again for coming on and
all
giving.
right, Dale. And we'll get ready for the next time and get into the so-called missing years.
Sounds great. All right. So take
Okay.
care, everybody,
All right.
and
Take care, Dale. Thank you.